Daenerys Targaryen stood upon the rolling dunes of blackened rock that spread across the desolation where nothing but ghosts remained. Embers of her past seemed to swirl around her in the ash-laden wind, each gust carrying whispered rumors of old Valyria's secrets. It was an eerie land, one that sang to her in the old tongue of dragons and fire-made flesh. She could sense the power that once dominated this realm, like an echo from deep within the scorched heart of the earth. The once mighty empire had shattered into a sea of volcanic stone and creeping toxicity, but somewhere amid the fumes and hidden caverns, Daenerys believed there was still life, or at least the possibility of it. Drogon circled overhead, the largest of her 3 children and the only one remaining at her side, his roar a triumphant salute to the sky that churned with smoke and distant lightning. He was restless in this place, uneasy yet enthralled by the lingering sorcery that had once birthed and shaped his ancestors. Her boots scraped on ancient obsidian as she moved carefully, every step a testament to her resolve. She had come here to find a future, one that she prayed still existed in the form of unhatched dragons. Stories floated through the taverns of Essos and beyond. Travelers claimed to have glimpsed monstrous shapes in the distance, winged silhouettes drifting between columns of steam and rolling volcanic clouds. Others spoke of hidden caches, relics of the Valyrian dragon lords left behind in the hurry and panic of the doom. Daenerys could not let such rumors rest untested. Too much had been taken from her, her birthright, her home, her children, and if there was a chance, however slight, to reclaim a piece of her legacy, she would risk even the fires of Valyria. Days of preparation had led to this trek. She had parted ways with loyal advisors who insisted she needed an escort of soldiers and ships, but she refused to burden them. The journey itself was an unknown terror, a labyrinth of reefs, boiling waters, and lethal storms. Few ships made the voyage intact. She knew her presence here was more than a mortal risk, it was a beckoning to ancient powers, an appeal to the blood of old Valyria that coursed through her veins. She was guided by more than just determination, there was something else, a pull as strong as destiny. The trek through the toxic waters and the labyrinthine straits had been harrowing. Yet Drogon, with an otherworldly sense, guided her caravel through swirling fogs and darting flames that erupted from the sea's surface as if the land itself were breathing fire. She and her small crew of sailors, men who had pledged themselves out of faith in her or perhaps out of fear, had navigated until they reached a perilous shore. She had urged them to stay with the ship, to guard it until her return. Bravery would do them little good if the land itself poisoned their lungs. Daenerys alone would walk among the bones of the past, armed with the protection her Targaryen blood and dragon might provide. And so she found herself alone except for the great black beast spiraling overhead. Clouds of sulfur hissed from cracks in the earth, forming a poisonous haze around the jagged crags. The sky was gloom. The entire world felt like the inside of a dying ember. Yet in that gloom, there was a magnetism that drew her deeper. She felt as if she were walking through the pages of a prophecy, though she knew how treacherous those could be. Ever since she first hatched her dragons in the Red Waste, Daenerys had learned that magic obeyed no mortal's beck and call without exacting a price. Still, her heart clung to hope. Another clutch of eggs could mean the future of House Targaryen, the promise of a new dynasty that might help her heal the realm she had so desperately tried to save. She could still remember the sweet warmth of her hatchling scales when they were small enough to perch on her shoulders. Rhaegal and Viserion were gone now, lost amid the strife that had consumed Westeros. Only Drogon had survived, grown large, fearsome, and solitary as a mountain peak. Some days she worried he had grown too wild, too unbound by mortal concerns to truly be hers. But as she glanced up and saw him gliding down in a slow, graceful arc, she felt a wave of kinship wash over her. Here, in this cursed realm, the two of them were meant to be together. Targaryen blood and dragon flame, mother and son, forging ahead into the gloom. Crouching beside a steaming fissure, Daenerys scooped a handful of black sand. It was coarse and burnt, warm to the touch even though the sky around her felt cold and foreboding. She let the grains trickle between her fingertips, lost in memory, visions of dragons roaring triumphantly over a united realm, of a fierce queen who once believed she could break the wheel of cruelty and oppression. She shut her eyes for a moment, breathing in sulfur-laced air that stung her lungs, refusing to let the bitterness of the past weigh her down. She was still here. She still had a purpose. A roar echoed from above. Drogon soared across the sky, a dark silhouette against the fiery horizon. He was calling her, beckoning her onward. She rose, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. The heat beneath her feet was tangible, and the steam swirled around her legs like ghosts eager to lead her astray. But she pressed on, guided by the faith that something out there remained, something that belonged to her and her alone. She would find the heart of old Valyria if she had to walk across every shard of obsidian in the land. She walked until her legs ached and a fine dust coated her hair and clothes. The oppressive weight of the atmosphere made every breath a struggle. Yet each time she neared her limit, she heard Drogon's distant cry or felt the subtlest tug within her chest, a whispered phrase of High Valyrian urging her to take just one more step. The wind tasted faintly of brimstone and memory, as if the past centuries of anguish could be inhaled and exhaled. Rocks jutted in odd angles, formations shaped by ancient cataclysms. Some rose like the spines of sleeping dragons, others towered in twisted spires. There was a sense that at any moment the terrain could shift and devour her. But she continued, slender as a steel blade forged by conviction. She came upon a ravine littered with molten rivulets, the remains of recent volcanic activity. The heat shimmered in waves that distorted her vision. Across this fiery boundary, she noticed a passageway carved into the basalt walls. Runes danced in her mind, Valyrian glyphs half eroded by time. She approached cautiously, her boots crunching on slag and melted stone. The opening was tall, large enough for Drogon to pass through if he folded his wings, but he contented himself to land behind her in a thunderous rush of air and dust. The dragon sniffed at the entrance, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Daenerys laid a hand on his flank, feeling his scales quake under her touch. "Steady," she whispered, though her heart pounded. A swirl of claustrophobic dread lay beyond, but also possibility. If the rumors were true, if secrets lay hidden in these labyrinthine depths, she would not stop now. She took a breath and stepped forward, the darkness swallowing her as she moved inside. There was an immediate shift in temperature. It grew hotter, but in a heavy, suffocating way, as though the air was loaded with centuries of arcane energies. Her eyes gradually adjusted, and faint glimmers of phosphorescent minerals lined the walls, casting eerie reflections that danced like pale ghosts. Drogon's claws scratched behind her as he followed, filling the cavern with the musk of a living dragon. The passage wound deeper, twisting and turning like a serpent's body, each new bend revealing more ancient Valyrian script etched into the rock. Sometimes Daenerys thought she could discern fragments of meaning, a word for blood, a phrase about the forging of shackles in fire. Much of it was too worn to piece together, and she realized how incomplete her knowledge was. She had only gleaned scraps about old Valyria's might, and so much had been lost to the doom. Time seemed suspended as they wandered those depths. She didn't know how far they walked or how many caverns they passed that branched off into the gloom. At times she paused, pressing her ear against the stone, certain she could hear a faint pulse, like a dragon's heartbeat. Perhaps it was the land itself, still throbbing with the memory of dragons' roars that once shook the foundations. She pressed on, heart pounding, determined to follow whatever unseen guide led her. When she turned a corner, a vast chamber opened before her, the ceiling rising into a dome supported by natural pillars of black stone. The phosphorescent minerals traced swirling patterns along the walls, and in the center glowed a pool of molten rock, bright with swirling oranges and reds. Steam hissed as it made contact with cooler surfaces, filling the space with a soft roar. Drogon let out a low rumble, and Daenerys could sense his excitement. She approached the pool's edge, the heat washing over her like the breath of a furnace. Thin tongues of flame licked the chamber's air as if the molten core of Valyria beckoned. In that moment, she felt an almost sacred hush fall around them. Her foot nudged something, a small mound by the stone. She crouched, carefully parting the dust. Her heart lurched. A shard of dull, leathery material, deeply scored with lines that could be scaling. A dragon eggshell. Old, brittle, possibly centuries past its prime. She picked it up delicately. Though the shell looked worn, something about it still radiated a faint whisper of power. She glanced at Drogon, who studied the shell with curious eyes, then hissed softly, stirring the dust. If one old shell had survived, could more remain? Perhaps even unhatched eggs, hidden in the labyrinth of caverns or protected by pockets of geothermal heat. Daenerys felt hope surge within her. Caution tempered her thoughts, though. The land was rife with illusions, and many a traveler had chased rumors in these ruins, never to return. Yet she was not just any traveler. She was Daenerys of the House Targaryen, the Unburnt, and she had come with a purpose that her entire being refused to relinquish. That night, or what passed for night in the land of endless twilight and volcanic glow, Daenerys camped in a recess along the cavern wall. She ate a little salted meat and drank sparingly of water. She let Drogon roam the chamber, half-dozing in his draconic fashion. In the shifting darkness, she remembered how her dragons used to watch over her as she slept in the wilderness. They were always perched on her or near her, little guardians of heat and flame. She missed those simpler days when the bond between mother and hatchlings was unbreakable. Now she was alone with Drogon, her solitary king. Yet in their solitude, they still understood each other on a primal level. She drifted into uneasy dreams of blazing cities, swirling ash, and the faint cry of an unborn dragon. At some point, a distant rumble woke her. She blinked, the gloom around her broken by the molten pool's glow. She saw Drogon was awake too, standing tall with wings slightly unfurled. The rumble came again, like thunder from deep below. The ground shook faintly. Perhaps it was just a shifting of tectonic plates or a release of steam. But Daenerys couldn't help but feel it was something else. She stood, her legs stiff from rest. The air felt alive with tension. She whispered a soothing word to Drogon, then ventured toward a narrow crevice in the far wall that seemed newly split or perhaps revealed by the shaking. Steam wafted through. She squeezed through the gap, hand trailing along the rock. The corridor beyond was stiflingly hot. The slightest brush of the walls singed her hand, and she had to pull her sleeve over her palm to continue. In her blood, she felt the old Valyrian resilience to flame, but even that did not make her fully immune to superheated rock. Drogon, though large, managed to wedge himself behind her with a scraping of scales against stone, determined not to let her walk alone. The path sloped downward and the rumbling intensified. The walls shimmered with a molten glow as if the entire chamber had been shaped from living fire. Then the corridor opened into a second cavern. This one was smaller, more enclosed, the heat almost suffocating. The center was dominated by a fissure in the ground through which liquid magma seethed, throwing off a violent orange light. Surrounding this fissure were objects half buried in layered ash. Carefully, Daenerys ventured forth, each step measured. She bent down and brushed ash away from a bulge in the ground. Her breath caught in her throat. It was an egg, slightly bigger than the ones she had once received as a wedding gift, its scales a deep obsidian flecked with streaks of fiery red. She touched it with trembling fingers. The shell felt warm, almost like living flesh. She did not stop. She dug her hands into the ash around it. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear nothing else. Another egg emerged, then another. She counted 4, then 6, each with its own faintly different coloration, some with silver striations, others with swirling patterns reminiscent of glowing embers. Tears blurred her vision. It was real. She could feel the subtle hum of potential life in them, as if the land itself nurtured them through an age of darkness and ruin. Drogon observed intently, inching closer. He sniffed at the eggs, releasing a low growl that vibrated with a note of wonder. His massive head turned to her, and she brushed her hand gently along the side of his jaw. "We found them," she whispered, voice breaking. "We found them." In that moment, she thought of the ancestors who had once reigned over the world with their dragons, forging an empire unmatched in power and cruelty. But she also thought of her own dream, her own vision of a world redeemed by fire. Could these eggs be a second chance for her, for House Targaryen, for the entire realm? Hope warred with caution. She had learned how fragile life could be, how easily illusions could shatter. Yet here they were, real eggs, still hot to the touch, likely sustained by the thermal energies beneath Valyria's cursed ground. If they hatched, it might take time, perhaps weeks, months, years for them to come forth. She had once performed a miracle by hatching her first trio through blood and fire. Would fate require another such trial? Or was the simple presence of dragon blood and the volcanic heat enough? She stayed in the chamber for hours, gently brushing the ash off each egg, marveling at their differences. Some were heavier. Some had shells patterned like shimmering scales of bronze or gold. Each seemed a treasure from a lost age. She could have stayed there forever, content in the glow of possibility. But the realm outside these caverns would never let her simply hide away. There were those who would hunt her, those who would fear or worship the return of dragons. She had seen how swiftly alliances could shift, how treachery could lurk behind every corner. Eventually, Daenerys realized she had to leave this place. She had a caravel waiting on the shores, a small band of loyalists who prayed for her safe return. And now she carried a greater burden than ever before. These eggs might shape the destiny of nations. She would take them, protect them with her life, and see them hatched if the gods were kind. Doubts gnawed at her as she considered the terrifying responsibility of raising another generation of dragons. But she recalled her own vow, to break the chains of those who suffered, to end the cycle of cruelty. Perhaps this was a sign from the old gods, from Valyria itself, that her mission was not yet concluded. Securing the eggs was no simple task. Even carrying them required caution. Each was hot to the touch, brimming with an energy that made her skin prickle. She placed them in a makeshift sling, layering them with cloth to insulate the heat. Drogon hovered protectively as she moved each egg, carefully maneuvering through the corridors. Several times, the ground quaked beneath them, sending clouds of dust cascading from the ceiling. She worried the entire structure might collapse. Yet guided by some form of intuition, she retraced their path until the faint glow of dayless sky seeped through the original cavern. When they finally emerged into the gloom outside, she realized how much time had passed. Perhaps more than a day, perhaps less. Time was meaningless under that perpetual haze. She inhaled the open air, even if it was foul with sulfur. Drogon spread his wings, letting out a triumphant roar that echoed over the jagged remains of Valyria's landscape. Daenerys felt a surge of gratitude that they had made it this far. But the journey was far from over. She was weighed down by 6 eggs, each brimming with the potential to change the world. Her mind raced with the challenges ahead, keeping them safe, finding a place where they could hatch in peace. She could not bring them to Westeros unprepared, not after what happened the last time she tried to unite a realm under Dragonfire. She would need allies, a new strategy, and perhaps a measure of humility that she had gained through her trials. She made her way back across the blackened terrain, each step a small victory. Drogon scouted ahead, sometimes guiding her around treacherous cliffs or pools of toxic steam. Once, a quake split the ground several yards away, hurling rock and ash into the air, but they pressed on. She was no stranger to hardship. Every challenge was a test of her resolve, every hazard a reminder that reclaiming a lost kingdom was never for the faint of heart. At last, near the edge of the ashen shore, she found the remains of the caravel and her crew. They had anchored in a precarious harbor formed by lava flows long solidified. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, and when they saw her approach, alive, no less, many sank to their knees in relief. Yet when their eyes fell on the eggs cradled in her sling, they murmured in awe and trepidation. She did not need to explain. They knew what they meant, what these relics represented. With careful hands, they helped her bring the eggs aboard, wrapping them in layers of cloth and furs. The men kept a wary distance from Drogon, who perched upon a rocky outcrop and watched with narrowed eyes. She wondered, briefly, if she should leave Drogon here to guard the land that had once been his ancestral home. But she knew that wasn't what he wanted. Dragons were not meant to dwell alone in ruins. And if any of these eggs were to hatch, Drogon's presence might be vital for their survival. He was the last living link to the knowledge of what it meant to be a dragon in a world that had nearly forgotten. He would fly overhead, a sentinel and teacher to the young. The idea filled Daenerys with a strange mix of hope and longing. She had always been mother to her dragons, but now Drogon would be something akin to a father to these unborn siblings. She wondered if he sensed the shift in destiny. The return voyage was treacherous. Steam vents in the water hissed and spat, threatening to boil the sea around them. The toxic fog rolled in thicker than ever before, forcing the crew to navigate by compass and the instincts of their queen's bond with Drogon. In the nights, the men whispered prayers in hushed voices, each mindful of the uneasy presence of the eggs. Daenerys tried to ease their fears, reminding them that dragons were not mere harbingers of doom but also the key to forging destinies and shaping empires. Yet she also felt a weight in her chest, the memory of the city she had burned, the families she had shattered. She vowed to never let her power slip into madness again. If a second chance had truly been granted to her, she must wield it with wisdom or not at all. Drogon took flight above the ship, flapping his colossal wings, parting the toxic mists. His roars challenged the storms that lashed them, as if daring the sea and sky to do their worst. It was an arduous crossing, but eventually, they broke free of the cursed straits that surrounded the Valyrian peninsula. When they saw open waters, free of boiling pockets and razor-sharp reefs, a cheer rose among the crew, despite their exhaustion. Daenerys stood at the prow, clutching the rail with a grip that turned her knuckles white. In her cabin sat the eggs, each cradled in separate chests lined with the softest materials they could find. She could almost feel them pulsing through the walls of the ship, calling to her. They were alive in their way. She prayed they would remain so, Days stretched into weeks at sea. Food grew scarce, and the men had to ration water. Yet none dared suggest abandoning the cargo. As they neared the coast of Essos, the seas became calmer. Daenerys decided to make landfall in a small bay far from busy trade routes. She had no intention of announcing her discovery to the world yet. Every port was rife with spies and opportunists. The simpler folk might worship her as a dragon queen reborn, but the powerful would see a threat. She needed a stronghold, a sanctuary away from prying eyes, where she could attempt to hatch the eggs in safety. Her thoughts turned to Meereen, to the city she had once ruled. The memory was bittersweet. She had tried to abolish slavery there, to foster a new way of life built on freedom. But her reign had been marred by sabotage and rebellion. The city had turned into a battlefield, though she had left it under Daario Naharis's governance. Where was Daario now? Would he welcome her return, or would he resent her for leaving him behind in a city constantly on the edge of turmoil? Even if she had parted with him on uncertain terms, he was once a loyal ally. And Meereen boasted the Great Pyramid, a structure with enough room to shelter dragons. It stood as a fortress, a vantage from which she could watch for threats. Yet Meereen had proven vulnerable in the past. She worried that forces beyond her control could slip in, that the sons of the Harpy or other factions might sense the power she guarded. The presence of these eggs would be a temptation for countless would-be dragon lords. She weighed her options as the ship finally docked at a deserted stretch of beach. Her men scouted the area, confirming no sign of immediate danger. Drogon took to the skies again, patrolling. In the fading light, Daenerys stood by the crates containing the eggs, her thoughts drifting between longing and fear. One night, while they camped inland near a stand of stunted trees, she lit a small fire. The crew rested in a loose circle, huddling against the chill that crept in with the desert wind. Drogon curled around the eggs, which were placed carefully in a ring of stones near the flames to keep them warm. Daenerys stared into the fire, recalling the night she became the mother of dragons, walking into the pyre of Khal Drogo with her first clutch of eggs. It had been an act of faith, a communion of blood and fire. She remembered the heat that should have killed her but instead awakened a new life, how she emerged unburnt, cradling her hatchlings. Even now, that memory felt like a dream, one she might never replicate. Magic seldom repeated itself easily, and the price for that miracle had been costly. Yet the spark of hope glowed within her chest as she listened to the crackling wood. She could attempt a similar ceremony, though it would require an unthinkable sacrifice. Who or what would she have to burn this time to awaken these eggs? She had no intention of repeating the horrors that once overshadowed her triumph. Perhaps there was another way: patience, nurturing the eggs with warmth and the presence of a living dragon. She stroked her palm over Drogon's warm scales, feeling the coiled strength beneath. He had grown so large since that night in the Red Waste. If anything could coax new dragons from their shells, it was the living flame of Drogon's breath and the shared blood they carried in their veins. As the days passed, she noticed a change in Drogon's behavior. He was ever vigilant, rarely straying far from the eggs. He nuzzled them with a gentleness one might never expect from a beast so deadly. She also found him snorting plumes of flame in their vicinity, raising the ambient temperature around them. It was as if some primal instinct guided him, teaching him how to father a new brood. When she knelt by his side, Daenerys could feel the pulses of warmth that radiated from the eggs, as though they were responding to him in turn. She wondered if he could hear heartbeats within those shells. The thought made her smile, a rare flicker of joy in a life haunted by regrets. Eventually, the small group agreed to head inland, to search for a hidden place where Daenerys could attempt to hatch the eggs in peace. They traveled by night to avoid prying eyes, leading pack animals burdened with the precious cargo. Drogon scouted overhead by day, sometimes resting atop rocky outcrops. The land was harsh and sparsely populated. A few goat herders and travelers passed by, but Daenerys avoided them, not wishing to draw attention to the presence of a massive black dragon. Rumors of a living dragon queen roamed every corner of Essos, and she could not afford to confirm such tales to the wrong ears. At last, They found a valley sheltered by steep cliffs, dotted with a few caverns and a winding river. The grass was brittle from the dryness of the climate, but the water source was reliable. With any luck, they could remain here unnoticed for some time. The men set up a crude camp, erecting tents and a small corral for the horses. Daenerys focused on creating a nesting area for the eggs, something reminiscent of the roost she had once built for Regal, Viserion, and Drogon in Meereen. She gathered stones and arranged them in a wide circle, ensuring the area caught the sun's warmth during the day. At night, she and Drogon took turns using fire to maintain a consistent temperature. She was no maester, but she remembered enough from her old scrolls to know that dragon eggs required long periods of intense heat to quicken. Sometimes, they might not hatch for generations, lying dormant until conditions aligned perfectly. Yet she refused to believe these eggs would remain inert forever. She had found them at the heart of old Valyria, where the heat of the world was more potent than anywhere else, and she had the living flame of Drogon at her side. If that did not awaken them, perhaps nothing would. Days turned to weeks. The men hunted wild game and collected what sparse crops they could find, sometimes risking short trips to a nearby settlement to trade for supplies. Daenerys mostly stayed in the valley, devoting her time to tending the eggs. She dripped water over them to cool the shells in the scorching midday sun. Then at night, Drogon heated the stones around them until they glowed faintly. She even tried reading to them softly in High Valyrian, recalling how she had often cooed to her first clutch. Silly as it seemed, she believed in the power of such intimate connections. Every dawn, she would kneel by the eggs, pressing her ear against their curved shells, straining to hear even the faintest scratch or shuffle within. She could sense a growing pressure beneath the surface, as if some embryonic stir of life was testing the boundary between existence and oblivion. Each day that passed without a hatchling was a day she struggled with doubts. She feared she might have come all this way only to find the eggs inert, remains of a lost era. But she refused to give voice to that fear. Her men seldom asked about the progress. They accepted her silent vigilance as part of the sacred duty of a dragon queen. She found herself reflecting on the violence that had once defined her reign. Burning fleets, sacking cities, punishing slave masters. Those had been acts she believed necessary at the time, fueled by righteous fury and a deep-seated desire to free the oppressed. But in the quiet of this valley, among the natural rhythms of the land, she questioned her own heart. She wondered if her dragons had been instruments of liberation or tools of vengeance. As she watched Drogon nestle gently against the eggs, she felt a tinge of guilt. They were neither good nor evil. They were living beings who took cues from their mother. If these new dragons were to thrive, she would have to be better than she had been, a caretaker of life, not a harbinger of destruction. One evening, as the sky turned a hazy shade of purple, Daenerys sat near a small campfire with her men. They ate quietly, listening to the wind rustle the sparse scrub around them. Drogon and the eggs rested in the stony nest. A man named Darrow, who had sailed with her through the Valyrian ruins, cleared his throat. "My queen," he said gently, "it's been many weeks. Do you think they'll ever crack?" A ripple of apprehension passed through the group. Eyes flicked to Daenerys, waiting for her response. She set down her bowl, gazing at the glow of the distant nesting area. "I believe they will," she said firmly. "But dragons follow no calendar. They come when they are ready. We must have patience." Darrow nodded, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The tension was understandable. They had risked their lives in cursed waters, ventured into monstrous lands, all for these precious eggs. Each day the eggs remained still and silent was another day their faith was tested. Daenerys felt the weight of their expectation keenly. That night, she could not sleep. She paced around the camp, her cloak flapping in the restless wind. Eventually, she found herself drawn to the nesting circle. Drogon lay curled around it, his head resting protectively over the stones. When he saw her approach, he rumbled softly, lifting his massive head. She placed a hand on his snout. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "You've guided me through this journey, as you've always done." She settled by the eggs, removing her glove. Despite the warm night air, the stones felt pleasantly hot beneath her hand. She leaned in, pressing her ear to the nearest egg, the one flecked with red veins in the obsidian shell. For a moment, all she heard was the steady thrum of her own heart. Then something made her stiffen. A faint sound like a scrape or a tap. She blinked, uncertain if it was just her imagination. She listened longer, breath held tight. Another faint tap. A flutter like wings against a cage. Daenerys's heart surged. She gently placed her other hand on the shell, tears gathering in her eyes. Drogon shifted beside her, craning his neck to watch her with a keen, burning gaze. She whispered in High Valyrian, "Dracarys? Azandes Rebas?" She wasn't sure what words to say, something about fire, something about flight. She only knew she wanted to encourage this flicker of life. A gentle swirl of warmth seemed to pulse from deep within the egg. It wasn't a hatch yet, but it was movement, a promise. She spent the rest of that night tending the fires around the nest, nudging the eggs closer to the hottest spots, careful not to scorch them. Drogon's flames, more controlled now than ever, fanned the circle of stones, creating a furnace-like environment. The men awoke at dawn to find Daenerys still there, eyes ringed with weariness but shining with fierce joy. She told them what she had heard, and at first they were hesitant, as if fearing to believe. But as the hours passed, the other eggs also began to stir. Soft scraping noises, the occasional tremor that caused fine cracks in the shell's surface. By midday, the entire camp was abuzz with trembling excitement. Cracks spread across one of the shells, the largest egg, which bore swirling silver patterns. Daenerys knelt, hardly daring to breathe, as fragments began to flake away, revealing slick black scales beneath. A tiny muzzle pressed against the shell, pushing. A moment later, the egg split fully, and a newborn dragon emerged in a shimmer of membranes and fluid. Its eyes were a milky color at first, its body no larger than a hound, but its presence was undeniable. The men gasped in reverence. Drogon roared triumphantly, flaring his wings so wide that they blocked the rising sun. The newborn hissed, trembling, trying to gain its bearings in the strange new world. Daenerys reached out a hand, letting it sniff her palm. She felt the delicate brush of its breath, a mixture of heat and curiosity. Its scales glistened a dark silver, almost mirror-like. She murmured soothing phrases in High Valyrian, remembering how she had coaxed Drogon and his brothers. The hatchling let out a squeaking growl, blinking. Then it nuzzled her hand, an acceptance that made her heart swell with indescribable wonder. The men cheered, tears glistening in their eyes as they witnessed a miracle. One by one, the other eggs began to crack. Each hatchling was unique in coloration. One was a deep copper hue with shimmering gold flecks, another a swirling emerald green that caught the light in shifting patterns, the next a smoky gray that seemed to absorb shadows, the next a pale, ghostly white that reflected the sun in ethereal brilliance, and the final one bore a rich red hue that smoldered with volcanic intensity. Daenerys felt each birth as if it were a chord added to a grand symphony, each note resonating in her soul. The camp erupted in joyous disbelief. Grown men knelt and prayed, some in the common tongue, some in their native dialects, praising the return of dragons. And as Daenerys held the newborn silver hatchling, watching its tiny chest rise and fall with each uncertain breath, she vowed anew to protect these creatures, to guide them with a gentler hand than she had once used. She would raise them not as weapons of war, but as guardians and symbols of what might be possible in a realm that so desperately needed hope. Drogon nudged the hatchlings, sniffing and blowing small puffs of smoke their way. At first they squeaked and cowered, unsure of this enormous beast. But they soon realized he was kin, and they began to crawl around him, squeaking inquisitively, trying to flap their fragile wings. He lowered his massive head, letting them climb on him. Their scales sparkled against his obsidian hide, a living mosaic of dragons. Daenerys stood back, tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the beauty of this moment. She thought of Rhaegal and Viserion, of the heartbreak she felt when she lost them. She thought of the children in King's Landing who perished in the flames of her rage. She thought of how close she had come to losing herself entirely. But standing here, in the clear morning light, with new life at her feet, she felt a chance to begin again. The realms of men and dragons did not have to be drenched in blood and terror. Perhaps she could guide these hatchlings, and they could guide her to a destiny forged not by domination, but by understanding. The days that followed were filled with a kind of humble awe. The hatchlings grew rapidly, feeding on goats and any game the men could procure. Drogon hunted regularly, bringing down larger prey and tearing off strips of meat that the hatchlings devoured greedily. Daenerys oversaw their feeding, carefully portioning what they needed, ensuring each got its share. She noticed how their personalities began to form. The silver one was bold and inquisitive, the copper one playful and prone to chasing insects, the green one watchful and cautious, the gray one aloof and independent, the white one skittish and easily startled, and the red one fiercely aggressive, snapping its siblings even during feeding. Daenerys found herself struggling with the red hatchling's aggression. She recalled how Drogon had always been the most temperamental of the three originals. She tried to soothe the Red One's fiery temper with gentle words, but it often hissed and snapped at her. She did not punish it, for she knew dragons did not respond to cruelty the way men did. Instead, she tried to mirror Drogon's method, firm but patient, letting the hatchling know that defiance would not push her away. Over time, it grudgingly accepted her presence, though it remained fierce and untamed. She studied the hatchlings constantly, reciting the scraps of knowledge she had gleaned about dragon lore from old texts and memories of what Ser Barristan Selmy had told her of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters. Though so much knowledge had been lost when Valyria was destroyed, she improvised, guided by her instincts as the mother of dragons. She learned to read their moods by subtle changes in their eyes and the angle of their wings. She discovered the pitch of their shrieks that meant hunger, pain, or curiosity. She even tried to teach them to respond to certain calls in High Valyrian, though it was too early to tell if they truly understood. Word inevitably spread. Goatherders and traveling merchants caught glimpses of dragons soaring in the distance, of a queen walking among them. Rumors whispered of a Targaryen reborn, raising a new brood in the wilds. Daenerys noticed more travelers passing near the valley, some simply gawking, others perhaps with more nefarious intent. A few times she spotted armed men skulking in the shadows, scoping out her camp. She realized that secrecy would not last much longer, that many would seek to either ally with her or destroy her before her dragons grew large. She made preparations to move the brood if necessary, to find a safer haven, or perhaps to sail to Meereen, where she still had some semblance of loyalists. Yet as much as the outside world intruded, Daenerys felt a rare contentment in the hush of dawn, when the dragons cavorted in the cool air before the day's heat settled in. She took solace in watching the newly hatched beasts discover their strengths, testing their wings in short glides or sputtering small flames that never failed to delight the men who watched. She spent hours with Drogon and the hatchlings, forging a familial bond that transcended the boundaries of speech. In those quiet moments, she found healing from the wounds of her past. This time, she would be the mother they deserved, guiding them not to ravage and conquer, but to protect and unify. Late one afternoon, she climbed a ridge that overlooked the valley. The sun blazed and the wind carried the sense of dust and wild thyme. Drogon soared overhead, a dark shape etched against the brilliant sky, and the 6 hatchlings flew behind him in wobbly formation. The image filled her with pride and a sense of renewal. Each day, their wings grew stronger, their flames hotter, their scales richer in color. She breathed in the wind, gazing toward the hazy horizon. Somewhere, across the sea in Westeros, a realm she once claimed as her birthright endured a fragile peace. Perhaps they feared her return. Perhaps they believed her dead. She thought of the Iron Throne, forged by the fires of a dragon's breath, and she wondered what role she might yet play in that realm's destiny. For now, she was content to remain in exile, teaching her new brood the ways of the sky, forging a bond that might outlast any throne. As she stood there, a wave of memories washed over her, visions of betrayal, heartbreak, ambition, love, and loss. She exhaled, letting the desert wind carry them away. The bright outlines of her future had yet to be drawn, but she sensed promise in every flap of the hatchling's wings. Let the lords of Westeros and the free city scheme and scramble. Here in this windswept valley, Daenerys Targaryen reclaimed her birthright in the most ancient, elemental way, with the flame of life, with dragons born anew from the ashes of doom. Drogon circled back, letting out a roar that echoed across the rocky escarpments. The hatchlings followed, squealing in delight, weaving in a loose arc behind him. Daenerys smiled. She raised her arms to them as they flew overhead, feeling the rush of wind and the brush of magic that lingered in the air. It was as if the ghosts of old Valyria sang in her blood, celebrating the renewal that fate had granted them. In that moment, she knew the real truth. She had indeed been granted a second chance, maybe not to conquer, but to heal, to guide, to become the queen she was always meant to be. And in that, she found a new kind of power, tempered by compassion and filled with the fierce spirit of dragons. So ended one quest, and so began another. She would nurture these hatchlings, teach them not the language of war, but of guardianship. In time, the world might come knocking, demanding fealty or seeking to extinguish her flame. But at least now, she would face whatever came next with the knowledge that she was not alone. Drogon and her new brood would stand with her, not as instruments of vengeance, but as living flames of rebirth. And if the realm was wise, it would learn from the mistakes of the past. For dragons had returned once more, and with them came both the hope and the warning that fire could as easily heal as it could destroy. In the days that followed her revelation on the ridge, Daenerys let hope and purpose settle once more into her soul. She watched the horizon each dawn, marveling at how the 6 young dragons struggled to follow Drogon's sweeping arcs. They would climb into the sky with uncertain flaps, only to plummet, shrieking, until they managed to catch themselves again on drafts of warming air. Their scales glinted with promise in the newborn light, the silver dragon shimmering like hammered metal, the copper one reflecting the sun's intensity, the green tinted with the hue of forest canopies, the white as brilliant as moonlight, the smoky gray as quiet as a shadow, and the red glowing with a smoldering undercurrent of fire. Day by day, they transformed the valley into a cradle of draconic life. Each sunrise seemed a little brighter, each dusk a little more peaceful, as though the land itself shared in the miracle of their growth. Her companions, sailors once trembling at tales of old Valyria, were slowly learning to live alongside these creatures. Their awe was interwoven with apprehension. After all, these were not docile beasts but living flames with minds of their own. Yet the men showed a reluctant reverence, bringing goats, sheep, and any desert game they could find, bowing as they fed the new brood. Daenerys sensed that even the most hardened among them felt the pull of something larger than themselves, a sense of participating in history. Some nights they would sit around the campfire, speaking in hushed tones of legends. How House Targaryen had once brought dragons to Westeros and carved out a kingdom by right of fire and blood. How, in ages past, Valyrian dragon lords soared through the skies as masters of magic and flame. And now, again, the world beheld newly hatched dragons, and a living Targaryen mother among them. Drogon stood as guardian. When potential threats wandered near the valley, be it a lone traveler or a scavenging hyena, he prowled the ridges and soared overhead until the intruder retreated. With time, the hatchlings also began to display the first sparks of territorial instinct. The red one, especially, hissed at any sign of perceived danger, puffing out a surprisingly hot breath for one so small. Though still far from Drogon's size, each of them showed daily growth, their bones elongating, their wings broadening, their appetites ravenous. Daenerys recognized in their prowling and occasional squabbles the seeds of future might. Even so, she remembered how Rhaegal, Viserion, and Drogon had once wrestled over scraps of food in her earlier days in Essos. Tiny things that she had coaxed into bonding with her. The memory was bittersweet, but it also gave her hope. They had flourished under her care. These new 6 might do the same, perhaps more gently guided now that she understood her own heart better. She walked among them daily, stroking their scaled necks, murmuring High Valyrian. The green one regarded her with large, curious eyes and emitted breathy squeaks whenever she approached with morsels of meat. The copper one had a mischievous streak, often darting away at the last second, forcing Daenerys or a crew member to chase after it with a chunk of goat's leg. The gray one was standoffish, often preferring solitude on a rock while the others napped together in a tangled mass of claws and tails. The white one stayed close to the brood, though it remained skittish around humans it did not know well. The silver one was perhaps the most openly affectionate, leaning into Daenerys's hand until it nearly knocked her off balance. And the red, ever the tempest, would crane its neck and flare its nascent wings if anyone or anything approached during feeding times. Its sharp squeals meant to warn away competition. In each of them, Daenerys saw fragments of the dragons she had lost, and something new as well, a glimmer of possibility unbound by the tragedies of the past. She reminded herself, endlessly, that they would become what she nurtured them to be, and so she told them stories of a world set free from tyranny. She spoke of wanting to protect those who could not protect themselves, though she knew in her bones that dragons, by their nature, were not protectors of men's laws. They were living embodiments of fire, and to keep them from destruction would require both the greatest tenderness and the firmest resolve. She would have to be vigilant. She remembered how Viserion and Rhaegal had once snapped at children in the streets of Meereen, their instincts guided more by hunger than by moral logic. She never wished to see an innocent life lost under the flame of these new hatchlings. And yet to try to dampen their true nature would be cruelty of another kind. In the midst of these contemplations, she also faced practical matters. Her stock of supplies was dwindling. The valley offered game, but not in quantities sufficient for such a hungry brood, let alone for the humans. The men were growing lean and haggard. They spoke openly of raiding smaller settlements for food, though Daenerys forbade them from doing so by force. She was determined not to repeat old mistakes, not to sow seeds of hatred in the very land where she sought to rebuild. So they ventured cautiously, offering fair payment for what they took, using trinkets salvaged from old Valyria or coin earned from the black market sale of a single chunk of raw obsidian pride from the cursed ruins. Still, it was never enough. The dragons devoured more each day, and soon they would need truly massive hauls of meat if they kept growing at this rate. One evening, as stars flickered in a dark velvet sky, Daenerys called the men together around the campfire. Drogon lay coiled near the tents, his presence a silent testament to her authority. The hatchlings dozed in their stone circle, lined with straw and heated with the leftover glow of Drogon's flame. She looked at the men Darrow who had first questioned whether the eggs would ever hatch. Balor, a veteran of countless sea voyages. Oren, a lean associate with sharp eyes who seemed half ready to vanish into the desert if times got tougher. And a handful of others, each weathered by the hardships of recent months. "We cannot remain hidden much longer," she said, letting her voice carry through the hush of the night. Each day, more travelers report sightings of dragons overhead. Each day, the hatchlings consume more. They must learn to hunt for themselves. And that means we must find a safe territory where they can spread their wings without fear of raiding villages or livestock. I do not wish to bring slaughter upon innocents, or provoke enemies before we are ready. Darrow shifted on his seat. "My queen, are we to head to Meereen then? I know you have allies there." She sighed softly, remembering the city's dusty streets, the tensions of its former slave population, and the precarious political arrangement she had left behind. "Allies, perhaps, but also many who resent my rule. And even those who welcomed me once might fear the return of more dragons. Meereen is large, too large to hide 6 hatchlings and Drogon. The city might see them not as a blessing but as a threat." Balor, who had once captained a small galley, cleared his throat. "What of the Dothraki plains, Khaleesi? The Sea of Grass stretches wide. Many warriors roam it, but they are not strangers to dragons after what they've heard of you." Daenerys thought of the Khaleesars, their proud riders, the endless grasslands. "Perhaps. Yet the Dothraki respect strength. If they see me with 7 dragons, they might bend the knee or they might test their mettle. We risk open battle. The hatchlings are not yet ready to defend themselves." Oren cast a glance at the swirling embers in the fire. "There's also Volantis to the south, my queen. The Temple of Lawlor might see you as chosen by the Lord of Light. You'd gain followers quickly among the Red Priests. They'd hail the dragons as the sign of a prophesied champion." Daenerys' lips pressed together. The memory of priests declaring her a savior in the past still unsettled her. She had believed once that she might be destined to break the chains of all slaves to liberate entire continents. But she had learned that prophecy could be a fickle mistress and zealotry a weapon as dangerous as any sword. "The Red Temple might welcome me, but such alliances often come with strings attached. We do not need more illusions of grandeur. We need a quiet place to grow strong." She let her gaze wander to the sleeping dragons, their tiny forms curled against each other like coals in a hearth. "I have decided we shall sail again eastward along the coast until we find a land suited to our needs. We will keep the hatchlings close, teach them to fish in the sea, to hunt in uninhabited realms if such places exist. Once they are older and more self-sufficient, we can decide where best to rebuild. Our mission has changed. We must raise these dragons wisely so they do not become instruments of destruction." The men exchanged uneasy looks, but no one voiced outright opposition. They had come to trust in her vision, or at least to realize that her bond with the dragons made her something beyond ordinary. And so they made preparations. Over the next week, they dismantled what they could of the makeshift camp, salvaging tents, provisions, and supplies. They constructed wooden crates padded with straw for the hatchlings, large enough that each dragon could rest without feeling confined, though Daenerys suspected they would soon outgrow these enclosures. For Drogon, no such crate could exist. He would fly alongside whatever ship or barge they acquired, or perch on the deck if he was so inclined. It would be a perilous journey, but she could think of no alternative that offered both secrecy and sustenance. Securing a vessel, however, was no simple matter. The men studied maritime charts, scratched into tattered parchments, trying to guess which port or cove might offer them the chance to buy or steal a ship without drawing too much attention. Daenerys was unwilling to turn to banditry. She had promised herself she would not repeat old mistakes by taking what was not freely offered. Yet coin was sparse and any large vessel would be expensive. Word might spread, too, of a silver-haired woman seeking a ship big enough to carry a monstrous cargo. Eventually, they learned of a small smuggler's bay a few days' ride north, near a cluster of scattered settlements that were rumored to be half lawless. There, a variety of shady deals took place, contraband changed hands, and questions were rarely asked. It was as good a lead as any. Daenerys left a portion of her men to guard the dragons in the valley while she and the rest journeyed to this hidden port. Drogon circled high overhead, shadowing them, sometimes vanishing for hours to hunt. Daenerys found comfort in the knowledge that if anything went awry, her greatest ally would descend in a flurry of wings and flame. They traveled under the cover of night, sticking to less traveled roads. By the end of the second day, they crested a ridge to see a ragged coastline below, a smudge of flickering lights that suggested lanterns or campfires. The bay itself was a tangle of crooked jetties jutting into the sea, surrounded by a rocky shore. Low structures leaned against each other as if each building needed support to avoid collapse. The smell of salt and rotting fish wafted in the air, mingled with the faint sound of rowdy laughter carried by the wind. Daenerys pulled her hood low over her face, though her silver-white braids still threatened to catch the moonlight. She and the men descended carefully, picking their way toward the cluster of half-built taverns and shacks. They heard muffled music and raucous voices, the sounds of a place where smugglers and cutthroats gathered after dark. Oren led them to an establishment that called itself, in crude hand-painted letters, the Drunken Clam. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and sweaty tension. Tables were crowded with travelers, sailors, and a few sellswords. A hush fell as Daenerys entered, the men behind her forming a half-circle of protection, their eyes scanning for threats. Then conversation resumed, albeit warily. A woman with silver hair, even hidden beneath a cloak, was not a common sight in this corner of Essos. Darrow sidled up to the scarred wooden bar. "Ale," he said curtly, handing over a coin to the barkeep who eyed him with suspicion. When the tankard arrived, Darrow sipped slowly, leaning in to speak to the barkeep. "Looking for a vessel, friend? Something that can handle a sizable cargo." "No questions asked." The barkeep grunted, his eyes flicking toward Daenerys. "Ain't my business to ask questions, but it's my job to know who to point you to. Talk to Rickio. He's the one in the corner with the green bandana. Might have a line on a ship. Be warned, he charges high." Daenerys let Darrow and Bali approach this Rickio first, hanging back near the entrance. She kept her hood low, fighting the tension in her shoulders. She could feel eyes on her from all corners of the smoky room. A few men glanced at the curve of her face beneath the hood. Some might simply be curious, but curiosity could turn lethal if anyone guessed her identity. Beneath her cloak, she wore a simple leather tunic, a belt knife concealed at her side. She missed the feel of her old sword, the one Yora had once given her, battered by time and conflict, but she dared not travel heavily armed. She heard raised voices. Glancing over, she saw Darrow and Balor in conversation with a short, wiry man wearing a stained bandana of sickly green. He kept glancing over their shoulders, presumably at her. His features shifted from scorn to intrigue as Balor produced a small pouch that jingled with coin. Daenerys suspected half of what remained in their funds was in that pouch. She inhaled, reminding herself that caution was the best policy. They had to play the part of ordinary travelers, or as close to that as they could manage in a place like this. Suddenly, a lanky man with a heavily tattooed forearm approached her. He reeked of stale ale and sour breath. "You're a pretty one," he slurred, leaning in uncomfortably close. "Don't see many pretty maids around here. What's your name?" Daenerys stiffened. The last thing she needed was a confrontation. "I'm no one," she murmured, trying to edge away. He grabbed her wrist, a leer twisting his features. "That's not very polite." She felt the stir of old anger simmer in her blood. She had dealt with men like this in the past, men who assumed that any woman could be bullied or claimed by right of brute strength. Once she might have flinched or turned away. Not now. There was a lethal grace in how she shifted her stance. With a quick move, she twisted out of his grip and shoved him back with her free hand, the heel of her palm connecting under his chin. He stumbled, crashed into a table, sending mugs clattering. Around the room, conversation died. Several pairs of eyes locked on them. Daenerys's companions tensed, hands going to their weapons. The man sputtered, red-faced. He looked as though he might charge forward, but something in Daenerys's glare, steady cold, made him pause. Then he spat on the floor, rubbing his chin, and stalked away amid a few jeers from onlookers who clearly found it amusing that he'd been bested by someone smaller and slighter than himself. The hush in the tavern lingered just a moment longer. Then conversation picked up again, the patrons evidently used to brawls. Daenerys kept her posture rigid, ignoring the pulse of adrenaline in her veins. She had not wanted violence, but neither would she tolerate insults. And in a place like this, a show of strength might even avert bigger trouble. Moments later, Balor returned, followed by the wiry man in the bandana, Riccio. He gave Daenerys a long, assessing look. "You're the one wanting a ship, I hear." She nodded. "We are." "Cargo?" he asked, raising a brow. "Nothing illegal," she lied smoothly. "Just large crates and some livestock. We need a boat big enough to handle the weight. Sturdy, ocean-worthy. We'll pay a fair price in gold or trade goods." A flicker of suspicion crossed his face. "Trade goods, eh? And how do I know you're good for it?" Balor rattled the pouch of coin. "We can give you half now, half upon delivery. Or half now, half in a port of your choosing. We don't plan on staying in your company forever." Riccio scratched at the stubble along his jaw. "Well, I might have a contact, a captain named Orsino who's got a caravel moored just beyond that cliff. Pretty big hold. She used to be a merchant vessel before some unfortunate business with Karth. But she ain't cheap." Daenerys measured him with her gaze. "Take us to the captain." He shrugged. "All right, but he'll want to see what he's working with. Livestock can be messy, could tear up the hold." "That won't be a problem," Daenerys said, forcing calm into her tone. "We'll ensure the cargo is secure." Riccio nodded, then beckoned them toward the door. They stepped back out into the night. The stench of seaweed and low tide was marginally better than the stuffy air within the tavern. He led them around a series of ramshackle huts, passing men huddled in corners playing dice by lantern light. The path twisted down to a narrow stretch of pebbled shore where the dark shape of a ship bobbed in the water. A gangplank led to the deck. Lanterns burned at intervals, illuminating a handful of sailors keeping watch. At a word from Riccio, one of the men hollered, and out came a stout, bald figure who squinted distrustfully in the torchlight. "Captain Orsino," Riccio announced, "these are the people I told you about. They need a ship for big cargo." Orsino eyed Daenerys. "What kind of cargo?" His voice held a rasp like a saw cutting through hardwood. She offered a half-truth. "We have some animals, rare creatures. We're looking to transport them east, beyond the known trade routes." "Why beyond?" the captain asked, pressing his advantage. Daenerys had prepared for this. "They need open space, perhaps islands or lesser-inhabited coasts. We're breeders, you see, looking to establish a new trade in exotic animals. The details are ours alone." Orsino's mouth curled in a skeptical grin. "And if these rare creatures tear my ship apart or kill my crew, you'll pay me how?" "We'll keep them contained," she said. "We'll pay you in coin for the inconvenience, enough to make this risk worthwhile. We'll feed them ourselves. All you need to do is sail." He took the pouch from Balor's hand, weighing it, then opened it to peer at the coins within. Whatever he saw seemed to mollify him. "I'll need more than this if you want to go far. But I'm not a man to refuse good gold. Show me these beasts first, so I know what I'm carrying." Daenerys fought the urge to refuse. She could not bring the dragons here without drawing immediate suspicion. She thought quickly. "They're not here, Captain. We have them inland, well guarded. But we can bring them to the coast soon as we strike a bargain." "You expect me to trust you without seeing them?" He spat overboard, then rubbed his bald scalp. "Sounds like a damned fool arrangement." Riccio put a hand on Orsino's shoulder. "Captain, take the gold. Half now, half on final delivery. You can see the crates before we set sail. Maybe even a glimpse of the beasts. After all, if they're paying enough, what do you care?" The captain's eyes flicked between Daenerys and the money. Greed was evident in his face. At length he shrugged. "Fine, but if I smell trouble, I'll cast you overboard faster than you can blink. I've had enough run-ins with rare creatures in my time. Don't think I haven't." Daenerys inclined her head, as though unruffled by the threat. "We have no interest in trouble. Only safe passage." So the deal was made. They haggled over details, how many men might board, how much cargo could be loaded, how long the voyage might take. By the time they finished, the night sky had begun to pale with the first hints of dawn. Daenerys stood on the shore, cloak wrapped tight against the chill. She and Orsino agreed they would gather the cargo and return to this cove in 1 week's time at most. The gold for the second half of payment would be exchanged upon departure. Neither side was fully content with the arrangement, but it was the best compromise possible when neither trusted the other. Afterwards, Daenerys and her men slipped away from the port, tired but triumphant. They had a path forward, uncertain though it was. She longed to gather the dragons and set sail before the captain or anyone else could change their minds. Yet the risk was monumental. How to load 6 young dragons and 1 massive one onto a single ship without inciting chaos or panic. They rowed fast, returning to the valley. The hatchlings greeted Daenerys with squeals and shrieks, crowding around her legs, nipping gently at her cloak as if in reproach for her absence. The silver one jumped onto a rock to peer at her face, blinking huge, curious eyes. She smiled, stroking its neck. Drogon landed heavily nearby in a rush of wind and dust, letting out a roar that rattled stones. She wondered if he was scolding her for leaving or simply announcing his relief at her return. Once the men rested, Daenerys called them together again. They stood in a loose half-circle with the dragons gambling at a safe distance, wrestling or fluttering short distances into the air. "We have a ship," she said simply, "named for no one's cause but gold. The captain isn't scrupulous but seems unlikely to double-cross us as long as we pay. We leave within a week." The men exchanged wary glances. "And the dragons?" asked one. "We can't hide Drogon in a crate." "No," Daenerys admitted, glancing toward her largest child. "He'll likely have to follow us by air. He can land on the ship if he chooses, but there is no hold that can contain him. As for the hatchlings, we'll design crates thick enough to keep them calm, but with ventilation so they can breathe. We must sedate them lightly for the loading, or they'll panic and burn the ship before we even depart." That suggestion caused a stir. Sedating dragons was uncharted territory. Daenerys herself felt uneasy about it, but she saw no alternative. She had gleaned bits of knowledge from Maester's texts and overheard stories of dragon binders and old Valyrian herbs. A mild sedative in their food, something to lull them into drowsiness for the short time it took to load them. She despised the idea, but it would be far better than risking an all-out conflagration or forcing the hatchlings into a terrifying confrontation with unknown sailors. So the men set to work. They built sturdy enclosures from thick planks reinforced with metal bands. They gathered pungent herbs from the edges of the valley, plants that local healers claimed could calm feverish livestock. Daenerys tested small amounts on the dragons over the next few days, mixing them into goat meat to see how they reacted. The red hatchling, suspicious by nature, spat out the first bite. The copper one ate it eagerly, then promptly fell asleep for half a day. Over time, Daenerys adjusted the doses carefully, determined not to harm them but only to lull their senses. By the 4th day, she felt she had found a safe formula. Drogon watched this process with what seemed like smoldering displeasure. He would rumble ominously whenever Daenerys coaxed the hatchlings with drugged meat. She soothed him with words, stroking the ridges of his neck. "We must do this, my son," she whispered, "or they may die in panic. You would not want that." The day of departure arrived in a rush of tension and nervous energy. They had decided on a night journey, hoping darkness would conceal Drogon's silhouette overhead. The men hauled the massive crates onto sturdy wagons. Then Daenerys fed each hatchling a portion of the sedative-laced meat. One by one, they grew drowsy. The silver one fought at the least, curling up in Daenerys' arms until its eyes slid shut. The red one hissed and squirmed, wings flapping, but eventually it too succumbed. With careful, trembling hands, the men lowered each sleeping dragon into its crate, shutting the doors and latching them securely. The muffled sounds of their slow breathing filled Daenerys with relief and sorrow. She hated confining them, but survival sometimes demanded hard choices. Under the moon's cold glow, the caravan set out. Drogon soared overhead, invisible except for the occasional flicker of starless darkness across the sky. Daenerys rode at the front, hooded once more, scanning for any sign of riders or bandits. Dawn was only a few hours off when they reached the smuggler's bay. The sea lapped quietly at the shoreline. Torches burned near the makeshift docks, and Orsino's caravel bobbed in silhouette against silver-tipped waves. The captain waited on the pier, arms folded, a guard of half a dozen sailors beside him. He eyed the procession of wagons with clear apprehension. "That's a lot of cargo," he muttered, stepping forward to examine the crates. "Hope your creatures aren't going to tear through the hull." "They won't," Daenerys said. "They're docile now. But be careful when you handle them. No sudden jolts." The men exchanged wary glances. There was a moment of stunned silence when they heard an echoing grunt from one of the crates, as if a creature was stirring in its sleep. Orsino's mouth tightened. If this goes south, your payment won't cover it. Daenerys said nothing, meeting his gaze levelly. She signaled her men to begin loading. With ropes, pulleys, and sheer grit, they managed to haul each crate up the gangplank. The ship groaned under the weight, but it held. The crates were placed deep in the hold, lashed to beams so they would not shift with the waves. Daenerys supervised every inch of the process, ignoring the curious stares and whispered remarks of the sailors. She could not afford an accident. The red dragon, half stirring, let out a low rumble that rattled its crate. She hurriedly draped more wet cloths soaked in the sedative mixture around its feeding trough, hoping it would breathe in the calming vapors. It subsided, though it twitched restlessly. Finally, the crates were secure. Dawn's light began to pool on the horizon. Orsino appeared at Daenerys' side, holding out his hand. She produced a smaller pouch of coin, the second half of their agreed payment. He snatched it, weighing it carefully. Now, he said, we sail with the tide. I warn you, if this cargo proves more trouble than it's worth, I'll unload it at sea. Clear. Daenerys did not doubt he meant every word. Clear, she said softly. The men cast off, hoisting sails. The hull groaned as the anchor rose and the caravel drifted away from the rickety dock. Daenerys stood at the stern, cloak snapping in the wind, watching the coastline recede. A sense of both relief and dread twined in her chest. They were committed now. No going back to the valley, no time to question the wisdom of uprooting the hatchlings. She lifted her eyes to the sky, scanning for Drogon. Initially, she saw nothing but drifting clouds tinted with dawn's pastel hues. Then, far above, a black-shaped sword momentarily blotting out the sun. It was him. He would follow as best he could, free in the open air, while she and the brood took to the uncertain ocean. The first day at sea was tense. The hatchlings stirred in their crates, occasionally letting out faint calls. Daenerys descended into the hold to check on them. The gloom reeked of mildew and stale air, but she tried to make the place as hospitable as possible, placing small braziers near the crates to maintain warmth. She discovered the silver dragon half awake, blinking sleepily. When it recognized her, it nudged the crate's slats, letting out a plaintive squeak. Her heart twisted at the sight. She whispered soft words, sliding her hand through an opening to stroke its head. The dragon pressed close, seeming to find comfort in her touch. She was acutely aware of Orsino's men loitering nearby, eyeing the scene with an odd mix of fear and fascination. When she returned topside, Oren reported that Drogon had been spotted off the port side, gliding in slow, lazy arcs. On occasion, he would dive and snatch a fish from the waves. The sailors, used to smugglers and pirates, were rattled by the presence of a full-grown dragon overhead. Daenerys overheard mutterings about curses about how the last person to meddle with dragons had come to a fiery end. She kept her composure, well aware that any sign of weakness or uncertainty could spur them to rebellion or sabotage. The gold they had paid was the only tether keeping this arrangement intact. At night, they lit lanterns and drifted on a calm sea. The hatchlings grew restless in the hold. Their squeaks became more frequent, echoing through the timbers. Daenerys worried they might attempt to breathe fire, though they were not fully grown. She double-checked the crates, ensuring the sedative troughs were still damp. The red dragon snapped at her hand through the slats, though it did not manage to scorch her. She saw small wisps of smoke curl from its nostrils. If it woke fully and grew frightened, the ship could burn in moments. The next day, they encountered a squall. Dark clouds swept in, whipping the sea to whitecaps, and the ship pitched dangerously. Water spilled onto the deck. The crates below began to shift despite the ropes. Daenerys braved the heaving hold to secure them further, straining with the men against the ship's lurches. The green hatchling let out a frantic screech that set the others bawling in unison. Lightning flashed, illuminating their wide eyes through the crate openings. Daenerys felt panic claw at her chest. If one crate broke, the dragons might thrash, tear, breathe fire. The entire hold could become a death trap, but the men managed to reinforce the crates with wooden braces. Soon the cargo area was a maze of hasty repairs and precarious lashings. Exhausted, they rode out the storm, hearts pounding as the waves battered them. Through it all, she heard Drogon roaring somewhere in the skies above, either rallying the storm or defying it. At last, the tempest passed. The crew, soaked and battered, assessed the damage. The mainsail was torn and the hull had sprung minor leaks. Orsino was furious, berating his men, but he did not blame Daenerys outright. This was, after all, an act of nature. They patched the leaks as best they could, and Daenerys comforted the dragons with hushed words. The white hatchling had a wound on its snout from knocking against the crate. She dabbed it with a cloth soaked in a mild antiseptic, cooing softly until it calmed. The men witnessed her tender care, and some seemed moved despite themselves, as if they had never envisioned a woman so fiercely protective of creatures that could one day level cities. That evening, they spotted an unfamiliar ship on the horizon. Fearing pirates or slavers, Orsino adjusted course, hoping to avoid contact. The other vessels seemed to shadow them at a distance, raising uneasy speculation among the crew. Daenerys stood at the stern, scanning the horizon. She had no banners to fly, no official claim of loyalty to any realm. If these watchers decided to chase them, they would have little recourse but flight, and with a damaged sail, flight might not be possible. She mulled whether to summon Drogon, to have him display a menacing presence that would scare off pursuers. But that might reveal too much or invite more trouble if the watchers took her for a threat worth hunting. Eventually, the unknown ship vanished from sight, possibly deterred by the memory of the storm or by other pressing matters. Still, the tension lingered. For 3 days more, they sailed, the sea stretching wide and empty before them. Daenerys seized every lull in the voyage to check on the dragons, feed them scraps of salted meat, and whisper reassurances. She worried the sedation might prove harmful if used too often, so she carefully reduced the doses, letting them wake in short, controlled intervals so they could move, stretch, and swallow water. The red one hissed whenever a sailor approached, spitting a few sparks that singed the crate's interior. The gray one seemed to brood silently, refusing to eat unless Daenerys personally offered it morsels through the slats. On the 5th day, Orsino informed them that they would need fresh water and more supplies if they intended to keep going. "I can't conjure food from the salt air," he said pointedly, glaring at Daenerys and her men. "Your creatures require a lot, and my stock's running low. We'll have to dock somewhere or anchor off a fishing village." Daenerys weighed the risks. Every port meant possible rumors, possible eyes drawn to the curious cargo. But the hatchlings and the men could not starve. She relented. They set course for a modest harbor that Orsino knew, a place known for fishing fleets rather than trade caravans. She decided that the crates would remain sealed in the hold, with Daenerys's men standing guard. Drogon, overhead, would also watch. He had become the silent sentinel of their journey, rarely letting them drift out of sight. At night, he would roost on the mainmast or the prow, making the sailors shudder at his proximity. And yet, no one dared challenge him. They approached the fishing village at dusk, sails furled, drifting quietly to a mooring. Lanterns glowed along the docks. The brine-scented air carried the sound of gulls and the clatter of fishermen unloading their catch. A few suspicious stares greeted the strange caravel pulling into the harbor. Orsino claimed they were simple merchants seeking resupply, a tale that satisfied no one but drew little overt hostility. Daenerys and her men stayed aboard, letting only Orsino's trusted sailors handle the bartering. She slipped down to the hold to be near the dragons, as if her presence might quell any chance of outburst. Darrow, one of her more resourceful men, ventured out with a handful of coins to purchase fresh fruit and grain. When he returned, he mentioned overhearing talk of a great black beast glimpsed in the sky at dawn, its wings spread like the devil's shadow. The fisherman claimed it must be a demon or a sign of ill fortune. Daenerys sighed. Rumors spread faster than any sail could carry them. She wondered if it might be best for Drogon to fly further out to sea during daytime. But the thought of him gone, even for a short while, made her uneasy. They needed him. He was their guardian, her bond to the ancient legacy that kept her heart strong. That night passed uneventfully. By dawn, they weighed anchor and slipped away from the harbor, the crate still intact, the hatchlings still drowsy under minimal sedation. The men exhaled relief as the last of the shoreline disappeared astern. Orsino studied the horizon, muttering about needing a final destination. "We can't keep sailing blind," he snapped. "Sooner or later, the men will want to know where they're going, and so will I." Daenerys joined him at the helm, gazing at the endless expanse of water. "East," she said, though in truth she was uncertain. "We may skirt the coast of Sithorios or beyond. Find an uninhabited region where the dragons can grow." "Madness," he growled. "Those waters are rumored to be filled with disease and monstrous creatures. Or so say the stories." She smiled faintly. "Stories often exaggerate. I'd rather risk that than bring war upon innocent people." "Humph," Orsino grunted. "Just remember, you promised me gold for a safe passage, not a suicidal expedition. I won't sail into waters where my men drop dead from plague or get eaten by giant lizards." Daenerys said nothing, allowing the awkward silence to hang. She had little room to negotiate. She had no illusions that Orsino was anything but a mercenary figure who might turn on her if the odds suited him. But for now, he had a healthy fear of Drogon, and that fear did as much as gold to secure compliance. So the ship pressed on, day by day. The hatchlings continued to adjust. They were growing more restless with each passing sunset. Their wings, once small and frail, had thickened. Their appetites surged. Daenerys reduced the sedative further, allowing them to be partially awake for feeding. She and her men would open the crates one at a time, letting a hatchling poke its head out to snap up morsels of fish or goat. A few sailors peered over shoulders, fascinated and terrified by the glimpses of reptilian snouts, teeth shining in the lantern light. Sometimes the men gawked at the dragon's colorful scales, whispering about which gods might have shaped such creatures. Daenerys tried to keep these feedings quick and controlled, always mindful that a single flare of flame could consume the hold. But for the most part, the hatchlings seemed too exhausted and confused by the rocking ship to attempt an escape. On one such evening, near twilight, she heard a commotion on the main deck. Rushing up, she saw Drogon perched on the forecastle, wings partially spread, roaring at the sea. A handful of sailors cowered behind barrels, while Orsino shouted at them to stand their ground. "What happened?" Daenerys demanded, pushing through the throng. "He caught a whale calf," one sailor babbled, pointing to the water. "Dropped it on deck. It's half the size of a horse. He's ripping into it." Sure enough, Drogon had dragged a large piece of bloody carcass onto the deck, likely snatched from the waves. He tore at the flesh, gulping steaming chunks. It was a fearsome sight, made more gruesome by the fading daylight's red glow on the wetwood. Daenerys took a breath, stepping closer. She placed a hand on Drogon's flank, feeling the tension in his muscles as he fed. His hunger was primal and wild, but he allowed her proximity without aggression. Once, a scene like this might have shaken her, but she had grown used to the brutal realities of how dragons ate. The sailors, however, were pale with horror. She glanced over her shoulder at them. "Fetch water to wash the deck after he finishes. No one interfere while he's eating, or you risk losing a limb." Orsino gave a shaky nod. The men moved about, hurrying to comply. Daenerys watched Drogon devour the meal, marveling at his size. Even after all these years, he never ceased to amaze her. Firelight flickered in his eyes like a forge. When he finished, he lifted his massive head, gore dripping from his jaws, and let out a triumphant roar that scattered any gulls or ravens nearby. He then leapt into the sky again, beating his wings in a whirlwind of salt air and rising wind. The men scrambled to swab the decks. Daenerys helped them, hauling buckets of seawater, mindful that the stench of blood could linger and attract sharks or worse. As darkness fell, she returned to the hatchlings below, feeling a pang of longing to let them roam free like Drogon. But she knew it was impossible right now. Not yet. Instead, she offered them smaller pieces from Drogon's feast, letting them taste fresh whale meat. The silver one's nostrils flared, and it gobbled the morsel quickly, squeaking for more. She obliged, though she had to ration it carefully to ensure each hatchling received enough. She saw in their eyes the same primal spark that shone in Drogon's, a flicker of something ancient and untamed. Over the next few days, they began rounding the southern coasts. The air grew warmer, the skies often teeming with strange birds. Some nights, drifting along quieter stretches of sea, they heard distant howls from unseen shorelines. The men spoke in hushed tones about the rumored horrors of Sithorios. Jungle plagues, monstrous reptiles bigger than ships, savage tribes. Orsino voiced more than once his desire to turn back and be done with this madness. Daenerys held firm, reminding him of the gold and the dragon overhead. Yet even she felt a coil of dread. She did not wish to venture so far into unknown waters that they could not return. But where else could she go? Westeros was haunted by the memory of her downfall. The free cities each had their own power struggles. Myreen's name still brought conflict to her mind. Here, at least, she could carve out a refuge to raise her brood away from the intrigues of men. One morning, a dense fog rolled in, blanketing the sea until the ship seemed adrift in a world of swirling gray. Visibility shrank to a few yards. Daenerys stood at the prow, straining to see. "Drogon will be lost in this," she murmured to Darrow. "He hates not being able to track us visually." As if on cue, a shadow materialized above, blotting out the pale sun. Drogon glided by, letting out a muffled roar. He must have heard the sound of the ship's creaking timbers or smelled the cargo. Sailors peered upward anxiously. Orsino cursed, ordering them to slow the vessel's speed lest they run aground on hidden reefs. Hours passed in this dreamlike murk. The world felt silent, reduced to the drip of condensed fog from the rigging, the soft flap of sails. Then a cry came from the lookout, "Land ho!" Daenerys felt a ripple of excitement through the ship. They crawled forward, sounding the depths. Gradually, an outline of dense greenery emerged from the mist, a shoreline thick with drooping trees and vines trailing into the water. It looked swampy, perhaps an extension of Sithorios or some large island. The men murmured in awe and wariness. Birds cried in the canopy, and now and then great splashes echoed from unseen creatures. Orsino anchored in a small bay where the water was relatively calm. "We can rest here," he said, "but I'll not go too close to that jungle. Looks like it wants to swallow us whole." Daenerys considered the lush treeline, thinking of the dragons. "We need fresh meat. Let me and a few men go ashore to see if there's good hunting. The hatchlings can feed and it will spare your stores." The captain snorted. "Better you than me. Just don't vanish in there. If you aren't back in 2 days, I'm leaving." She did not doubt him. Gathering a small group, Daro, Balu, and 2 others, she prepared to head ashore. Each man was armed with a spear or bow. Daenerys took a short sword and a hunting knife. She left explicit orders for the rest of her men to guard the hold. She did not want the sailors peeking too long at the dragons or meddling with the sedation troughs. The hatchlings would remain on board for now, though she ached to set them free to hunt. That would be a sure way to lose them in the alien jungle or spark a terror if they flew off in confusion. Drogon, of course, needed no such constraints. She saw him perched on a higher ridge of rock near the treeline, a silent shadow among the drifting fog. They rowed a small skiff to the muddy shore, boots sinking into dark silt. The air was thick with humidity, buzzing insects, and the heavy scent of damp vegetation. Towering trees with twisted roots stretched overhead, draped in vines that seemed to sway like serpents. Strange bird calls and rustlings echoed around them as though the jungle itself breathed. They ventured inward cautiously, marking their path with strips of cloth tied to branches. Daenerys' senses were on high alert, every crackle of underbrush sending a jolt of tension through her. They found traces of wild boar, tracks in the mud, fresh droppings near a waterhole. Bala pointed out scratch marks on a tree, likely from some large reptile. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but hunger drove them on. Eventually, they flushed out a small herd of boars near a clearing. With practiced skill, Daro loosed an arrow, striking one in the flank. The beast squealed and ran. The others scattered. Bala pursued, spear in hand. They cornered the wounded animal and delivered a swift end. Daenerys, though hardened by many hunts, still felt a pang of empathy for the creature's pain. But necessity overrode sentiment. The hatchlings needed meat, this was the cost of survival. They tied the boar's legs and hauled it back toward the shore. On the way, they spied more game, a large bird with plumage of vivid turquoise and a scaly crest. Bala and Daro managed to bring it down as well. By the time they reached the skiff, they carried enough fresh meat to feed the hatchlings for at least a couple of days. Sweat drenched their clothes and insect bites burned their arms, but the sense of accomplishment was strong. Drogon swooped low overhead as they emerged onto the open shore, letting out a rumble that might have been approval. Back at the ship, the men hoisted the boar onto the deck with a block and tackle, garnering whistles of admiration from some of Orsino's crew. Daenerys wasted no time. She went below, had her men open each crate in turn, and fed the dragons generous chunks of raw flesh. The silver one squeaked joyously, gulping down strips. The green one clawed at the crate's rim as if trying to climb out. Daenerys had to push it gently back, murmuring reassurance. The red one nearly scorched the boar's flank with a spurt of flame before devouring it, turning its scaled snout blood red. The others fed more quietly but no less hungrily. With each swallow, Daenerys sensed a growing power in them, as if the raw energy of fresh prey ignited their draconic instincts. She felt torn. Confine them further, or risk letting them out onto the deserted shore for a supervised hunt. The latter was tempting, perhaps it would ease their restlessness, let them grow strong. But the memory of the ghostly jungle rose in her mind, the shifting vines, the unknown predators. If the hatchlings were spooked and flew off, or if they encountered something deadly, she might lose them forever. No, it was too soon. That night, the fog swirled thicker than ever, turning the moon into a dim halo. Daenerys retreated to the quarterdeck, leaning against the rail, exhaustion weighing on her. She closed her eyes, listening to the sea's gentle lapping. Then she sensed a presence near her. She opened her eyes to see Daro approach, his face etched with concern. "My queen," he said softly, "how much longer can we keep them caged? They grow every day. We risk breaking their spirits, or worse, driving them mad." She swallowed, the truth heavy in her chest. "I know," she whispered. but to release them into unknown lands would risk losing them. They aren't ready to follow commands, nor do they yet understand loyalty like Drogon does. Patience is needed. Just a little longer. Darrow hesitated, then nodded. I trust your judgment. Many do. He paused, but the crew's nerves are fraying. Orsino especially. He mutters about turning back, about the dragons being more trouble than they're worth. Daenerys gazed at the swirling water below. Let him mutter. As long as we have gold left and Drogon overhead, he won't abandon us. She straightened, forcing resolve into her voice. Tomorrow we'll search for a more suitable shoreline. Maybe a stretch of open beach where the hatchlings can at least exercise. We must move carefully. I won't see them suffer, but I can't risk their escape. Not yet. Darrow accepted this, though doubt flickered in his eyes. He walked away, leaving her alone with the hush of the night. Daenerys let the wind cool her face. She wondered if she was merely postponing the inevitable. Could dragons ever truly be contained? She thought of the catacombs in King's Landing, where the Targaryen rulers had once chained their dragons. The beasts had grown smaller over generations, their spirits crushed. She refused to replicate that tragedy. Yet the memory of her own devastation in Westeros cautioned her. Unbridled dragonfire could cause unspeakable destruction. Morning found the bay clear of fog. Orsino announced they would skirt the coast further, searching for calmer inlets. The men hoisted sail. Drogon soared in broad circles overhead. Daenerys felt a surge of hope. Perhaps they would find a safe cove, a broad beach near gentler terrain, free from monstrous beasts. A place to let the hatchlings run free, to teach them flight without endangering innocence. Around midday, they caught sight of a long, curving shore of pale sand. Beyond it stretched a savanna-like plain, dotted with clusters of trees and gently rolling hills. It looked more inviting than the swampy jungle behind them. Orsino anchored at a respectful distance. Daenerys took her small party ashore again, armed and cautious, to scout. Instead of fetid swampland, they found grass that swayed in a warm breeze, groves of baobab-like trees, and herds of strange deer-like creatures bounding away at their approach. No sign of villages or men, just the hush of an unclaimed land. She felt her spirits lift. They spent the afternoon exploring. At one point, they glimpsed enormous footprints in the soft earth, some huge reptile or amphibian, but they found no direct evidence of immediate threat. Insects buzzed, and bright birds fluttered overhead. The air was hot but bearable. Daenerys turned to Darrow and Baller. This may be the place. We can land the dragons here at dawn. Let them stretch their wings in the open. We'll keep them under watch, see if they hunt. Drogon can help corral them if they stray too far. They returned to the ship with the news. Orsino grumbled but saw no harm if they didn't linger too long. At sunrise the next day, the men lowered the crates onto skiffs, an operation fraught with tension. The hatchlings, partially sedated, stirred and rumbled. Daenerys soothed them with gentle words. Drogon swooped low over the water, as if guiding them to shore. Once they reached the beach, the crates were unloaded onto the sand. The men formed a wary ring, spears and bows ready, just in case. Daenerys stood in the center, heart pounding. She unlatched each crate carefully. The silver one emerged first, blinking in the dawn light. It spread its wings wide, inhaling the sun's warmth. The green, copper, white, gray, and red followed in a chaotic scramble, staggering on the unfamiliar sand. Each dragon hissed or squeaked, uncertain of this sudden freedom. Then Drogon landed with a thunderous impact, scattering sand in all directions. He rumbled a greeting, and the hatchlings squealed, flocking to him as if to an older sibling or parent. Daenerys felt tears prick her eyes at the sight. For a moment, the brood simply basked, as though overwhelmed by sky and wind. Then the green one bounded forward, chasing a small lizard skittering across the sand. The silver one took a running leap, flapped its wings, and managed a short, awkward glide before crashing headlong into a dune. The copper turned in circles, chasing its own tail. The white stayed near Drogon, peering around with wide, startled eyes. The gray shook sand from its scales and watched everything warily. The red sniffed the air, as if searching for something to challenge or devour. Daenerys advanced slowly, calling to them, praising them in soft Valyrian phrases. She gestured to the open grassland beyond. "Fly, my children," she murmured. "Fly, but do not stray too far." Her voice choked slightly. She wanted them to taste freedom, but 1,000 worries warred in her mind. Still, how else could they become what they were born to be? The men held their breath, weapons at the ready, though Daenerys had ordered them not to attack unless the dragons posed a direct threat. The hatchlings seemed too enthralled by their new environment to pay much mind. One by one, they ventured out into the waving grass, sniffing, bounding, flapping. Drogon trailed behind them with a proprietary air, occasionally nudging them in a different direction if they wandered too far. Daenerys followed at a cautious distance. She noticed Daro's anxious expression, as if he feared an ambush of monstrous creatures or perhaps that the hatchlings would vanish over the horizon. Hours passed in this surreal display of draconic exploration. The hatchlings snapped at insects, roared at passing birds, and attempted short flights. The Silver actually managed to stay airborne for half a minute, letting out a triumphant shriek before wobbling back to Earth. Daenerys' heart soared. This was what she had dreamed of, dragons roaming free, guided but not chained. Near midday, the red one abruptly took off, flapping furiously. It gained perhaps 20 feet of altitude, drifting toward a nearby hill. Drogon roared a warning, launching after it. Daenerys and the men scrambled to follow on foot. By the time they crested the hill, they saw the red perched on a rocky outcrop, staring at something beyond. Daenerys pushed through tall grass. Her breath caught. Below, in a small valley, a massive reptilian beast basked near a waterhole, perhaps 30 feet in length, with thick scales and a ridged back. It resembled a giant lizard or crocodile, though broader and taller. It paid no mind to the red hatchling overhead, swishing a heavy tail in the muddy water. Drogon circled warily, letting out a snarl. The red screeched in challenge. Daenerys' blood ran cold. If the red attacked, it could be a disastrous fight. She broke into a run, waving her arms, shouting in Valyrian for the hatchling to come back. The red, heedless or perhaps too young to understand, dove at the giant reptile. The creature reared up with a roar that reverberated across the valley, snapping a massive maw full of razor-sharp teeth. The red hatchling spewed a burst of flame that washed harmlessly over the beast's thick hide. In a flash, the reptile lashed its tail. The impact caught the red midair and sent it tumbling to the ground with a pained shriek. Drogon roared, diving in. His flame was no infant spark but a torrent of searing fire. The reptile bellowed in rage. Smoke enveloped them in a swirling inferno. Daenerys reached the edge of the valley, heart hammering, as the men arrived behind her. She saw Drogon slam onto the reptile's back, claws raking. The monstrous creature thrashed, snapping at Drogon's wing. The red hatchling lay stunned nearby, struggling to rise. Fire burst from Drogon's maw again, scorching the reptile's face. It screeched and lunged, managing to clamp down on Drogon's forearm with monstrous jaws. Drogon howled, black wings beating furiously, tail lashing the air. "Arrows!" Daenerys shouted at the men. "Aim for its eyes." Even as she said it, she knew how risky it was. One arrow astray could strike Drogon. But they had no choice. Daro and Bala drew bows, loosing arrows that whistled through the smoke. One sank into the creature's neck, another flew wide. Daenerys sprinted downhill, eyes burning from the heat. The reptile flailed, dragging Drogon off balance. Drogon's roar shook the earth. He clawed at the beast's jaws, raking deep gouges. Then, with a final torrent of flame, he forced the reptile to release him. Its hide smoking and cracked, the reptile tried to stumble away, but Drogon lunged, sinking his teeth into the creature's exposed flank. Another wave of flame seared across its back. The reptile's dying bellow was deafening. It crumpled, sides heaving, finally collapsing under Drogon's onslaught. Daenerys reached the red hatchling, which lay panting, one wing twisted at an odd angle. She knelt, gently examining it. Blood stained the juvenile scales where the tail strike had scored flesh. The hatchling hissed weakly but did not resist her touch. Tears blurred her vision. Drogon stood victorious over the smoking corpse of the monster, chest heaving, black scales gleaming with fresh wounds. His arm bled from the bite, but he let out a final roar of triumph, the savage cry echoing among the hills. The other hatchlings arrived in a flurry of squeaks and alarm, gathering around the red. The silver rubbed its snout against its sibling's flank. The green hissed, pacing protectively. The white cowered behind Daenerys, and the gray watched with narrowed eyes. Daenerys stroked the red's neck, whispering, "Be still, my child. We'll mend you." She looked up at Drogon, who limped toward her, smoke still drifting from his jaws. Their eyes met, mother and son, a silent understanding passing between them. He had saved the younger dragon, but not without cost. The price of venturing into unknown lands was blood and pain. The men arrived, gawking at the scene. The dead reptile lay half submerged in the waterhole, steam rising from its charred flesh. One of the men spat. "Gods above, that thing is enormous." If Drogon hadn't intervened. Daenerys nodded grimly. "This is the risk. We cannot predict the dangers here, not for ourselves, not for the dragons. But at least we know they'll defend each other." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and cloth to carry the red hatchling. Daenerys dressed its wounds, wiping away blood and applying a paste of herbs for infection. It whimpered but remained still in her arms, its eyes half-lidded. Drogon tolerated the men's attempts to clean his wounds, though he growled when they probed too close to the swollen bite mark. Once they were stable enough to move, the group trudged back to the beach. The other hatchlings followed in anxious formation, subdued by the violence they had witnessed. The remainder of the day blurred into a tense vigil. Daenerys refused to sedate the wounded red again, fearing it might complicate healing. Instead, she let it rest in its crate, the door propped open so it could see and smell its siblings. She used strips of cloth to wrap the injured wing, uncertain if it would heal fully. Drogon curled near the shoreline, licking his wounds, occasionally raising his head to watch any approaching figure with wary eyes. Orsino, upon hearing the tale, muttered that they were insane to linger in such a place. But Daenerys stayed, tending to the Red's injuries for several days, letting the others roam the beach in shorter intervals. She studied them with a new caution, always scanning for predators or hazards. The bright illusions of an easy refuge had faded. Now she understood that the world beyond civilization could be as deadly as any city steeped in politics. Still, the hatchlings grew. The Red, while still limping, managed to stand by the end of the week, stretching its bandaged wing. It gazed at Daenerys with a haunted look as though it had glimpsed mortality for the first time. Watching them, Daenerys's resolve hardened. She could not simply hide forever. Danger lurked in every corner of the world, whether in the hearts of men or in the jaws of monstrous beasts. Sooner or later, she would have to decide what role these dragons would play in the grand tapestry of life. Would she continue drifting along unknown shores, dodging pirates, predators, and storms? Or would she gather allies, forge a new city, a haven for dragons and those who believed in their potential to do more than terrorize? As the Red's wounds improved and Drogon's bite scabbed over, Daenerys called the men together on the beach. The 6 hatchlings dozed in a cluster near the water's edge, Drogon looming protectively beside them. Orsino joined the meeting reluctantly, arms crossed. "We've come far enough," he growled. "I've done my part. Now either choose a destination or let me sail back to more sensible waters." Daenerys stood barefoot in the sand, the salt wind blowing strands of silver hair across her face. She scanned the horizon, the rolling savanna, the distant haze. This land is no safer than any other. We've seen the creatures it holds. We have no knowledge of how far the dangers extend. And my dragons are still young. They need to explore, to learn, but not in such peril. Oren spoke up, voice trembling slightly. "Then what do we do, my queen? Return to Meereen? Seek out allies in Volantis or Pentos?" She gazed at him, the weight of her past pressing on her heart. "If we approach Meereen with dragons, we could incite a power struggle. Many factions would see an opportunity to claim them or to kill them. Yet leaving them in the wilderness courts another kind of death. I cannot raise them alone. I need a people to stand with me, to feed and shelter them, to build a future in which dragons are not feared as mindless weapons." Darrow nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "You want to find a balance, a city that welcomes dragons but doesn't provoke war. Is there such a place?" Daenerys lifted her chin. "If it does not exist, we must create it. But first, we must find the will of those who still believe in me, in what I once sought to do. There may be freedmen in Slaver's Bay who remember my rule fondly, who long for the return of the breaker of chains. Or perhaps others who have only heard rumors and might flock to my banner if they see these dragons." Orsino snorted. "TCH, fine. Then we head north again, do we? Back toward Meereen." Daenerys took a breath. The notion dredged up 100 memories of revolts, of Dario, of uncertain alliances. But it also stirred a faint hope. She had grown, and so had her dragons. Maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild something worthy of them. "Yes," she said at last. "We'll sail north, but we'll approach carefully, establishing outposts along the way if we can. We won't storm the city. We'll see what state it's in and decide our path from there." The men shifted, murmuring among themselves. Fear and excitement mingled in their expressions. The hatchlings stirred, roused by the humans' voices. Drogon flicked his tail, sending a small spray of sand into the air. He seemed to sense a change in Daenerys' demeanor. She looked at him, then at the men. "One step at a time," she said. "We'll move carefully, mindful of the dragon's safety. And if we must fight, we will, but only if we have no other choice." Thus, they prepared to depart from the savage shore. They lifted the crates again, coaxing the dragons back inside, though with less sedation this time as they had grown somewhat accustomed to the process. The red hissed indignantly but did not struggle much, its injuries reminding it that it still needed rest. Drogon soared overhead, scanning the grasses for any lurking monsters until all were aboard. The men rowed back to the ship, stowing the crates securely in the hold. Orsino glowered, but he raised anchor without further protest, perhaps eager to leave these unknown reaches behind. As the coastline faded astern, Daenerys stood at the prow, letting the wind wash over her. She felt a surprising sense of purpose. She had turned away from Meereen once, believing her destiny lay in Westeros. That had ended in blood and heartbreak. Now, she returned not as a conqueror but as a guardian of new life, 6 young dragons that represented possibility and a cautionary reminder of what she had lost. Perhaps in the city she once ruled, she could forge a new beginning, one built on the lessons she had learned through fire and ashes. If the inhabitants welcomed her with open arms, she would do her best to keep them safe. If they did not, well, she would decide what to do when the time came. For now, the dragons needed a stable sanctuary, and Meereen was the closest place she knew that might become one. Over the coming days, the wind shifted northward. The seas remained temperamental, but they avoided another major storm. Daenerys visited the hold often, ensuring the wounded red hatchling's wing did not fester. Each day, it seemed to heal a little more, though she worried it might never fly as strongly as its siblings. Still, the red showed determination, hissing whenever Daenerys tried to limit its movement. She had to admire its spirit. She also noticed the gray had grown especially aloof, seldom interacting with the others during feeding times. It would eat its share, then retreat to a corner of the crate, watching. She wondered if it harbored some resentment or fear from the predator attack. The silver remained affectionate, the green playful, the copper mischievous, and the white timid yet slowly learning to stand its ground. The brood was as varied as a rainbow of scaled possibilities. Daenerys felt each one's distinct temperament, forging a bond that transcended language. When they finally reached the outskirts of Slaver's Bay, a swirl of conflicting emotions churned in Daenerys's heart. She recalled the day she had marched triumphantly into Meereen, freeing the slaves and dethroning cruel masters. The city had been her laboratory for justice, and it had nearly devoured her with rebellion and betrayal. She had flown away on Drogon's back, leaving behind an uncertain peace enforced by Daario Naharis. That felt like another lifetime. Who ruled Meereen now? What had become of the people she had tried to help? Orsino, for his part, was plainly wary of entering the bay. If this city is as dangerous as you say, my men won't disembark, he warned, pointing to the distant sprawl of Meereen's outer harbors. We'll anchor offshore while you do as you please. Then I'll take my payment and sail away with or without you. Daenerys nodded, her voice subdued. Agreed. You've served your purpose, Captain. Once the dragons are safely ashore, you may go. I have no desire to keep you here. He grunted. At least I'll have a story to tell if anyone believes me. He glanced warily at the dark shape of Drogon circling overhead. As they drew closer, they saw merchant ships, fishing vessels, and the tall silhouette of Meereen's great pyramid rising above the city's skyline. The bay seemed calmer than Daenerys remembered, dotted with trader sails. There were no war galleys flying the city's banner, no sign of immediate unrest. Still, she sensed tension in the breeze, as if the city itself remembered the storms of the past. Daenerys and her men concealed the crates below deck while they found a secluded cove a league or two from Meereen's main harbor. Landing in broad daylight with dragons would provoke panic. She resolved to scout the city first, in disguise, to learn who held power. That night, she and a handful of men took a small boat along the coast, landing near a beach south of the city walls. Drogon stayed behind, though Daenerys knew he could find her if needed. She hoped to avoid a spectacle. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the once familiar gates, passing half-deserted farmlands and abandoned huts. Time had changed the outskirts, there were fewer slaves tending fields, fewer guards patrolling. They made their way to a lesser entrance that led to the poorer districts. Daenerys wore a plain cloak, hooded, her face mostly hidden. Her heart pounded with each step on the cobbled streets. She heard the buzz of life, vendors calling, children laughing, the clang of a smithy. Yet behind it all lurked a subdued air, as if the city had not entirely recovered from its past upheavals. She and her companions kept to the shadows, listening for news. They overheard whispers of a council ruling in the absence of a single monarch. Daario Naharis' name was mentioned only once and in a bitter tone. Rumor claimed he had left Meereen years ago, heading north. Some said he had grown bored or broken. Others claimed he had been forced out by the council for being too lenient with dissenters. No one knew for sure. Prying further, they learned that the city still officially forbade slavery, though the practice had revived underground in certain quarters. Freedmen lived precariously, lacking the firm hand that Daenerys once tried to provide. The council taxed heavily, leading to resentment, but no one had mustered the strength to openly rebel. The Sons of the Harpy, the dreaded insurgents who had once plagued her rule, were rumored to be gone, yet remnants might still skulk in the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike. It was a city tenuously balanced between memory and necessity, neither thriving nor collapsing. Daenerys felt tears threaten as she walked the familiar streets incognito. She remembered the day she had stood on the Great Pyramid's balcony looking down at throngs chanting her name. She had promised them freedom, justice, and prosperity. Now she saw quiet desperation, small crowds, hushed voices, an air of tired acceptance. She wondered if her departure had been the cause, or if the city's destiny would always have been strife no matter who led it. She felt a deep responsibility to these people even now. After gathering what information they could, they slipped out of the city before dawn, returning to the cove. Daenerys stood on the shore, the cool surf lapping at her boots, lost in thought. The sky began to lighten. She knew what she must do, reveal herself to Meereen, not as a conqueror but as a potential protector. If the city's council was wise, they might welcome her help. If not, she would find those among the people who still believed in her ideals. With them, she could build a safe haven for the dragons. Even a small enclave would be enough at first, somewhere they could roam under the sun without unleashing terror on innocents. She told her plan to her men, to bring the dragons ashore in a controlled manner, establishing a camp outside the city walls. She would send envoys to the council offering peace and cooperation. Many of her followers seemed uncertain, but they trusted her leadership. Orsino, for his part, demanded the remainder of his payment and prepared to depart. That same day, they lifted the crates from the hold and lowered them onto the beach. Drogon landed with a thunderous gust, the morning sun glinting on his black scales. Then Daenerys, with quiet ceremony, unlocked each crate. The 6 hatchlings stepped onto the sand, flapping their growing wings in the salt breeze. The red's bandaged wing looked improved, though still stiff. It growled softly, as though remembering its near-fatal encounter. Daenerys murmured encouragement. They were stronger now, each standing half as tall as a man at the shoulder. Their voices were louder, their teeth sharper. Drogon watched them with a paternal air, as if assessing their readiness. Orsino stood back with folded arms, a mixture of awe and relief in his expression. "So that's it then," he said. "You and your dragons here, near the damned city. I hope you find what you're looking for." Daenerys handed him a final pouch of gold. "For your services. And a warning, speak not of what you have seen. If rumors spread, you may face those who would kill to learn where we've gone." He tucked the pouch away, face grim. "I've no interest in tangling with more dragons. Good luck, Targaryen." She nodded. "Fare you well, Captain." With that, Orsino and his crew boarded the ship and rowed away, sails hoisted for open water. Daenerys stood on the shore, the hatchlings milling around her, Drogon perched on a crag of rock near the beach. Her men began setting up a temporary encampment, tents and lean-tos in a rough circle. This was only the beginning, she told herself. Soon, the city would learn she had returned. Would they call her savior or monster? She could not know. But she would face them openly, carrying in her wake the living symbol of her house's legacy, dragons reborn from the ashes of doom. That day and the ones that followed were a flurry of activity. Daenerys dispatched riders and runners into the city with messages to the council, introducing herself as Daenerys Stormborn, Mother of Dragons, and offering parley. The response came swiftly in the form of a delegation that arrived at dusk on the third day. They emerged from the gate on horseback, escorted by a handful of guards in mismatched armor. At their head rode a middle-aged woman in robes of muted gold. Her face was lined with worry, but her posture spoke of dignity. She dismounted, approached Daenerys with guarded politeness. "I am Kala of Meereen," she said, "a representative of the city's council. We received your letter, and we come to see if it is truly you." Daenerys pushed back her cloak, letting them see her face, her silver hair braided in the old Targaryen style. A hush fell among the delegates. Some wore expressions of astonishment, others fear. "I am Daenerys Targaryen," she said. "I have returned with dragons, but I come in peace. I wish to speak with your council about forging a future, one in which my brood can flourish without bringing harm and your people can benefit rather than suffer." Kala studied her intently, eyes drifting to the silent shape of Drogon perched a short distance away. The hatchlings were behind a low rise, out of direct sight. "Rumor claims you disappeared years ago, that you traveled across the narrow sea. Now you return, with more dragons." Daenerys inclined her head. They are young and need safe territory. I have not come to claim the throne or enslave Meereen. I come to build something better than what existed before." One of the guards scoffed under his breath. Kala silenced him with a raised hand. "Your rule was tumultuous, Daenerys Targaryen. Many remember it with gratitude, but others curse your name for the chaos and warfare that followed. The city has tried to find balance under our council since Dario Naharis left. But we are not as strong as we'd like. We cannot simply hand you the keys." Daenerys heard a note of caution in Kala's voice, but also a hint of hope. She spoke evenly. "I do not ask for unconditional surrender or rule. Only a place at the table to work alongside you. In return, my dragons can protect the city from outside threats if needed. They can be a shield rather than a torch of destruction." Kala's eyes flicked to the men behind Daenerys, then to Drogon. "You speak with reason, but many in Meereen will fear you. We must proceed carefully or risk inciting panic in the streets. Let me consult with the council. If they agree, we will invite you to speak within the city walls without your dragons. Will you trust us?" It was a delicate request. Daenerys knew stepping into Meereen unarmed could be a trap. Yet if she refused, she might confirm their worst fears. She glanced at Drogon. He remained still, but she sensed his tension. If she was harmed, he would raise the city. That at least was a deterrent to betrayal. She nodded slowly. "I will come with a small escort unarmed. Drogon and the hatchlings will remain outside for now." Kala exhaled, relieved. "Then we shall see if peace is truly possible. I will send word." They parted ways, the delegation returning to the city with more questions than answers. Daenerys returned to her camp, heart-pounding. The next steps would define her relationship with Meereen forever. She spent a restless night, watching the moonlight glint on Drogon's scales, hearing the soft breathing of the hatchlings in the distance. This was no simple matter of conquest or liberation. She had to prove she could coexist with the city, that her dragons would not become beasts of war. Whether they would succeed depended on her ability to navigate politics as deftly as she once navigated the harsh desert wastes. Morning broke, and sure enough, Kala arrived again, accompanied by a different entourage, some solemn-faced men and women in layered robes. They invited Daenerys to the Great Pyramid at midday. She accepted, selecting just 3 of her men to accompany her, leaving the rest to guard the dragons. Drogon growled when she told him to stay, but she placed a hand on his snout, meeting his burning gaze. "Watch over your siblings," she whispered, and he seemed to understand. They rode borrowed horses into the city. The gates opened with an air of cautious welcome. Citizens lined the streets, some murmuring, some pointing in awe, some recalling the days when Daenerys had walked among them. She saw faces of old and young, many sunken-cheeked, many with the brand of past enslavement still visible on their skin. She wished she could speak to each one, explain why she had left, assure them she returned with good intentions. But all she could do was hold her head high, meeting their stares. Some cried out Misa, while others muttered curses. As they neared the Great Pyramid, she glimpsed the wide steps where she had once held court. The braziers, the banners, all changed now. Instead of the dragon sigil or the harpy, a simple patchwork of colored flags adorned the columns, symbolizing the council's shared governance. Inside, the sprawling halls were quieter than she remembered, with fewer guards. Kala led her to a central chamber where 6 council members were seated on raised chairs. The air smelled of incense and dust. Daenerys stepped forward, addressing them calmly. "I come before you not to reclaim a throne, but to offer cooperation. My dragons and I wish to settle peacefully outside your walls. We will not intrude unless you invite us. In return, we hope to trade for goods to ensure enough resources to feed and care for the brood. And if danger threatens Meereen, we stand ready to help defend it." An older man with a stern countenance spoke. "Your presence alone may invite danger. Many will see the dragons as a threat or as a prize to be seized." Daenerys acknowledged this with a nod. "Then let us face that danger together rather than as enemies. I know trust must be earned. Allow me a chance to prove that I have learned from the past." Silence followed. She could feel their scrutiny, the weight of their memories. Finally, a younger woman with sharp features said, "If you can truly control these dragons, if you can keep them from scorching our fields or devouring our livestock, then perhaps your presence could be beneficial. Slavers Bay has many enemies still, and pirates prowl our coasts." Kala raised a hand. "We must vote. A formal measure on whether to permit Daenerys Targaryen and her brood to remain near Meereen." A hush fell. The council members leaned in, exchanging murmurings. Some argued quietly that it was too dangerous, others that it might be an opportunity for renewed prosperity, especially if Daenerys's reputation still inspired loyalty among some of the freedmen. After several tense minutes, the vote was cast. The result, by a narrow margin, was acceptance, but with conditions. Daenerys would remain outside the walls until further notice. The dragons would not enter the city unless summoned, and any harm done by them to Myreen's people or property would be grounds for immediate expulsion or worse. Daenerys exhaled, relief mixing with anxiety. "I accept your conditions," she said, voice steady, "and I will do my utmost to ensure the dragons do no harm." The council dismissed her politely, though not warmly. Kala escorted her back to the courtyard where her 3 men stood waiting. As they left, the older man with a stern face called after her, "Remember, Targaryen, your dragons may protect or destroy. The choice is yours. We will not suffer a second reign of chaos." Daenerys bowed her head in acknowledgement. Outside, the city thrummed with curiosity. Rumors spread with each passing moment. Some were calling her the Dragon Queen reborn, others the curse of Myreen returned. Children pointed, wide-eyed, chanting, "She's back. She's back." A few older folks reached out to touch the hem of her cloak as she passed, tears in their eyes. She wished she could linger, speak to them, but for now caution reigned. She and her escort rode back to the gates, then onward to her camp by the sea. At the camp, she found the hatchlings dozing in the afternoon sun, Drogon watchful as ever. A wave of emotion washed over her. These creatures were both her burden and her hope. She stroked Drogon's head, leaning her forehead against his scaled brow. "They've allowed us to stay," she whispered. "But we must be careful." Drogon rumbled in his chest as if he only half understood, but the bond between them was enough. Daenerys turned to her gathered followers. "We have a foothold," she announced. "We are not exiles. Myreen has given us a chance, though we stand on thin ice. We will camp outside the walls, build a settlement, trade with the city, and keep the dragons fed without harming their people. In time, if the city grows comfortable with us, we may integrate more fully. If pirates or slavers threaten, we will defend Myreen. We'll show them that dragons can be guardians, not tyrants." The men murmured assent. Some hearts were uncertain, but Daenerys' confidence was infectious. She felt a surge of determination. This was her second chance. To rule not through terror, but through understanding, to guide dragons in a way that might heal rather than destroy. The path ahead would be long, fraught with pitfalls. Enemies would surely rise. But for now at least, she had a place to begin anew. And so began the labor of building a new home. They erected more tents, scavenged driftwood, hauled stones to mark boundaries. Hunters from Myreen's outskirts cautiously approached, bartering game for goods. Daenerys paid fairly, forging small bonds of trust. When the hatchlings roamed the beach, she ensured watchers stood guard, ready to herd them away from any passing villagers or livestock. More than once, fishermen cried out in alarm at the sight of a winged silhouette, but Daenerys' men reassured them and no attacks ensued. The council sent officials to observe to ensure the dragons weren't marauding. They found the brood mostly placid, especially after Daenerys introduced them to a reliable supply of goats purchased from local herdsmen. The Red's wounded wing continued to heal, though it could only manage short flights. Daenerys oversaw daily exercises, coaxing each hatchling into controlled bursts of flame, praising them when they followed her commands to hold or cease. The city's watchers stared in wide-eyed fascination at the display of draconic discipline. Weeks drifted by, turning into months. The small encampment gradually took on the shape of a fledgling settlement. Freedmen and curious travelers trickled in, offering their skills if Daenerys would accept them. She was cautious but welcoming, remembering how infiltration and betrayal had plagued her in the past. Kala visited regularly, forging a tentative rapport. She was a pragmatic leader, understanding that if Daenerys truly wished to defend Myreen, she might be an asset. Some members of the council remained hostile, insisting the dragons were a catastrophe waiting to happen. But with each passing day, no catastrophe came. The hatchlings grew, soared, hunted fish in the bay. Drogon shadowed them like a great black warden. Trade between Daenerys' camp and the city increased. Farmers sold produce, fishmongers brought fresh catches. In return, Daenerys' people offered small crafts or coin gleaned from her diminishing treasury. At night, under the stars, Daenerys sometimes closed her eyes and remembered Westeros, the Iron Throne, the ashes of King's Landing. She wondered if any raven would carry news of her survival across the sea, if her name still cursed the tongues of those who had once knelt to her. Yet the guilt that had once consumed her felt softer now. Here, she was slowly forging a new identity, not just as a conqueror but as a caretaker. Occasionally, trouble flared. Pirates raided a nearby fishing village, and the council asked for help. Daenerys sent Drogon and 2 of the stronger hatchlings, the Silver and the Grey, to drive the raiders off. The pirates fled at the sight of dragons, their ships nearly capsizing in their haste to retreat. Word spread that the Dragon Queen had protected Myreen's people without demanding tribute or sovereignty. A cautious respect took root. Freedmen began to speak her name with hope once more. Even some of the council's skeptics grudgingly admitted her presence brought stability. Kala confided that the city's old enemies hesitated to provoke open conflict, fearful of draconic retaliation. Yet Daenerys knew not all threats lay outside the city walls. Whispers reached her ears of conspirators who loathed the notion of a Targaryen returning to power. Some rumored the Sons of the Harpy might regroup in secret. She assigned watchers to patrol the edges of her camp at night, while Drogon perched on the bluff overlooking the settlement. The hatchlings, now large as small horses, slept in a communal nest the men had built with stones and sand, ringed by fire pits that kept them warm. Daenerys walked among them often, humming lullabies in High Valyrian, forging an intimacy that eased their more volatile instincts. One afternoon, Kala arrived with an urgent message. A group of armed men had taken over a portion of the city's eastern quarter, calling themselves Liberators of Meereen. They claimed that Daenerys' presence was a pretext for returning the city to slavery under a Dragon Queen. They incited riots, burned a warehouse, and threatened to kill any who recognized Daenerys' authority. The council was paralyzed, uncertain how to quell the unrest without provoking further violence. Daenerys' heart sank. She remembered too well how a spark of rumor could ignite chaos. "What would you have me do?" she asked Kala. The councilwoman hesitated. "If you send your dragons into the city, it might confirm their worst fears and turn half the population against you. But if we do nothing, the riots will spread." Daenerys pressed her lips together. "We must act quickly. I'll go unarmed and attempt to reason with these so-called liberators. If they see I come in peace, perhaps they'll lay down arms." Her advisors recoiled at the idea. Darrow said, "They could kill you on sight, my queen." Daenerys lifted her gaze to Drogon, who prowled the edge of camp. "If they harm me, Drogon will raze them to the ground. That is not a threat, but a fact. I believe they know it. It might force them to parley." Kala nodded, though she was pale. "I can summon city guards to accompany you, but I fear many guards sympathize with these liberators." Daenerys took a deep breath. "Let us go with minimal force, then. Show them we do not intend oppression." So she ventured into Meereen once more, accompanied by Kala, Darrow, and a handful of loyal guards. The streets were tense, shutters closed, graffiti scrawled on walls, "Death to the Dragon Queen." Smoke drifted from a burned-out block. They followed the sound of chanting, coming upon a crowd of angry faces gathered near a public square. At their heads stood a tall man in patched armor, brandishing a sword. He lifted it high when he saw Daenerys approach. "Look, people of Meereen," he shouted. "The so-called breaker of chains returns with dragons to shackle us anew. She claims to protect us, but she would turn us into thralls cowering beneath her beasts." A roar of approval came from some in the crowd. Others looked uncertain, glancing from the flames of wrecked stalls to Daenerys' calm face. She stepped forward, pushing back her hood. "I come alone," she said, voice carrying. "No dragons beside me, no army to threaten you. If I meant to enslave the city, would I not arrive with fire and blood instead of words?" The tall man sneered. "Words? A queen's words mean naught if she can unleash monsters at any time. And you call that freedom?" She met his gaze without flinching. "My dragons serve me, but I do not serve tyranny. I freed Meereen once from the grip of slavers." "Is that a lie?" Some in the crowd murmured, recalling how she had toppled the great masters. The man's voice rose. "Aye, you freed them, only to plunge us into war after war. The city bled while you chased your own ambitions." Anger flared in Daenerys' chest, but she kept it contained. "I made mistakes. I left too soon. But I did not return to seize your city or your lives. I live outside the walls, trading fairly, punishing no one. Is that the act of a conqueror?" The man lifted his sword. "You lure us into complacency while your dragons grow. Then one day you'll devour us. We've seen what dragons can do. King's Landing burned under a Targaryen. Word has reached even Meereen of your massacre across the sea." A hush fell. Daenerys felt a bolt of shame and sorrow. King's Landing. The horror she had unleashed. She steadied herself, speaking quietly, "And I bear the guilt every day. I will not repeat it. Slaughtering innocents was never my intention. I lost myself in grief and rage. But that is why I am here now, to atone by protecting those in need, not destroying them." The crowd murmured, uncertain. The tall man snarled, "Words again. Show us proof if you truly seek peace. Submit to Meereen's council, why you will never crown yourself queen here. Pledge that if your dragons harm a single citizen, they will be exiled or destroyed." Daenerys bristled at the phrase destroyed, but she understood the people's fear. She glanced at Kala, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. Then she turned back to the crowd. I will swear before the council and the gods old and new that I do not seek a throne. My only throne is the trust of those I protect. If one of my dragons, by my fault, burns the city, I will bear the consequences. I will not become a tyrant. Those are the terms I offer." The tall man hesitated. It was clear he had expected a more defiant response. His followers shifted uneasily, the ferocity in their eyes dimming. Some looked at Daenerys as if rethinking their hatred, yet tension still crackled in the air. One spark, one shout could ignite violence. Daenerys drew a breath, stepping closer, arms raised to show she had no weapon. "Let us end this destruction before more innocents are harmed. I accept oversight by the council if it eases your fear. I only beg that you do not punish my people for crimes that have not been committed." At that moment, a woman in the crowd rushed forward, tears streaming. She fell at Daenerys' feet, clutching at her cloak. "You freed my children from a slaver's whip," she sobbed. "You gave us hope. Do not abandon us again." Daenerys gently lifted the woman. "I do not intend to." Seeing this, more bystanders murmured approval. The chanting for violence faltered. The tall man lowered his sword fractionally, looking troubled. Eventually, he spat, "Fine. We will stand down for now. But we will watch you, Targaryen. If your dragon so much as sear a child's hair, we will drive you out." Daenerys inclined her head. "Your vigilance is understandable. May the day never come when you must act on that threat." She turned to the crowd. "Go home. Rebuild what was burned. If any need shelter, my camp is open to them, as is the council's aid." She glanced at Kala, who gave a stiff nod, accepting the responsibility. Thus, the riotous spark in Meereen subsided. Daenerys and Kala began to draft a formal agreement, an edict that outlined the terms of coexistence between the city and the dragons. Though it was not the triumphant reclamation of power Daenerys might once have envisioned, it was a step toward healing. Her vow not to claim the throne, to subject herself to the council's oversight, sent ripples through the populace. Some praised her humility, others derided her weakness. But the violence eased, and for the moment, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Daenerys continued to nurture her dragons along the shores, training them to respond to commands in High Valyrian. She assigned watchers to keep them from straying near the city, especially at night. The Red's Wing healed slowly but surely, and eventually it managed a short flight that ended with a clumsy landing on the beach. Tears of joy filled Daenerys' eyes as she helped it back to its siblings. Drogon continued his vigilant watch, proud and formidable, though he accepted fewer direct commands. She understood that he was a creature of will and flame, bound to her through an unspoken covenant of love more than authority. As Meereen's citizens grew accustomed to the presence of dragons on the horizon, trade blossomed. Merchants traveled from nearby towns, hoping for a glimpse of the brood. Enterprising individuals began carving small dragon figurines to sell as souvenirs. Kala quietly told Daenerys that city revenues had risen, fostering cautious optimism. The council even permitted Daenerys to open a dragon market outside the walls where visitors could see the hatchlings from a safe distance and buy tokens or trinkets. The funds helped feed and house Daenerys' growing community of followers. She only allowed these viewings under strict supervision, for she had no desire to reduce her dragons to caged attractions. Still, it was an arrangement that satisfied Meereen's desire to profit from this unique spectacle, and it kept the dragons from appearing in the city unannounced. Gradually, the settlement at the beach turned into a small but thriving port of its own. Daenerys had a makeshift pier constructed for boats to land. Some ex-slaves built humble homes there, preferring the queen's protective presence and the majesty of dragons to the city's cramped quarters. Daenerys made certain that these newcomers contributed to the collective good, not leeching from Meereen's economy. She was determined not to create a rival city-state but a partnership. Kala visited often, and although tensions remained, they managed to resolve disputes with talk rather than swords. Sometimes at twilight, Daenerys would stand at the water's edge gazing out at the horizon. She would see Drogon's silhouette against the fading sun, the hatchlings darting behind him in playful arcs. In those moments, she felt a profound gratitude. Life had given her another chance, one she did not take lightly. She remembered the horrors of King's Landing, the heartbreak of losing Regal and Viserion, the madness that had nearly consumed her. Now she walked a new path, forging alliances instead of burning them. And through her dragons, she hoped to show the world that fire could be more than a force of destruction, it could be a beacon of rebirth. One evening, as the sky blazed with sunset, she climbed a dune near the settlement to watch the brood. They soared in the rose-colored air, calling to one another with high, keening cries. Drogon led them in a grand spiral, his ebony wings cutting through clouds. The silver, the copper, the green, the white, the gray, and the healed red followed, each weaving their own patterns. The sight took Daenerys's breath away. She felt tears slip down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of awe at the magnificence of living flame made flesh. She thought of her ancestors, the dragon lords of old Valyria, who had mastered such creatures and forged an empire. Perhaps she was unworthy of that legacy by their standards. She had no desire to rule the world. But perhaps she had found something more precious, a peaceful understanding between dragon and human, the promise that with enough patience, fire could illuminate rather than incinerate. She listened to the beating of their wings, felt the thrum of possibility in her blood. In the hush of that final glow of day, Daenerys Targaryen whispered a promise to herself, to her dragons, and to those who placed their faith in her: no more ashes. Only life. And as the 6 young dragons danced in the crimson sky, backed by the deep roar of Drogon's protective presence, she believed, truly believed, that this time, fire would bring light instead of darkness, hope instead of despair. Thus, with the warm wind against her face and the taste of salt on her lips, she embraced the future unfolding before her, a future where a dragon queen might yet heal the wounds of a broken world. In the weeks that followed the crimson sunset, Daenerys Targaryen found an unusual rhythm settling over her life. Each dawn brought new developments, messages from the Myrinese Council, petitions from farmers requesting more structured feeding arrangements for the dragons, cautious invitations to festivals in the city. She woke early, dressed in simple leathers, and walked the sandy perimeter of her growing settlement. The new structures rose daily, modest huts with thatched roofs, a few sturdy wooden cabins near the shoreline. A wooden jetty now extended into the sea, allowing small fishing boats to moor. People moved about carrying goods, trading, laughing. Some were ex-slaves who had drifted from Meereen and found hope in Daenerys's presence. Others were travelers from distant corners of Essos, intrigued by rumors of dragons and the reborn dragon queen who preached a gentler creed. All around, she felt the invisible hum of aspiration. The freedman's port, as some had begun to call it, pulsed with a subdued but steady optimism. Smiles came more easily than they once had. Hunger was less acute now that fishing had improved, and Daenerys's men hunted across the plains, returning with game for the community and for the brood. The 6 young dragons grew larger by the day, each now as tall at the shoulder as a strong man. Whenever they soared overhead, local children squealed in delight, running to catch glimpses of shining scales. The settlement had begun forming rudimentary watchtowers, though they were more symbolic than practical. Real protection came from the sky, from Drogon, from the brood, and from the promise that if violence threatened, dragonfire stood ready. Still, Daenerys never let herself sink fully into sea. Complacency. She remembered her earlier reign in Meereen, how sabotage had lurked behind friendly masks. While many in the city now supported her or at least tolerated her presence, she knew malcontents survived, either from old rivalries or from fear that her dragons might one day burn everything. But she had changed. She no longer clung to illusions of absolute control. Each day, she reminded herself to listen. To her people, to the council, to the quiet murmurings in the streets that signaled tension or contentment. Each whispered rumor told her how to move, when to yield, when to stand firm. She was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had once cost her so dearly. Late one afternoon, she found herself in a simple wooden building that served as her audience hall. The structure had wide windows cut into the walls to allow a breeze from the sea. The floor was bare, the walls hung with only a few modest tapestries. A line of petitioners stood outside, awaiting her attention. Many had come from Meereen with small disputes or requests. Daenerys sat on a wooden chair, flanked by 2 of her most trusted men, Darrow and Balor, who had followed her through old Valyria and beyond. She no longer wore regal dresses. Instead, she donned a gray tunic, a simple belt, and practical boots. Silver hair, braided and pinned back, still marked her as Targaryen, but the ostentation of past times was gone. Next, she called, voice gentle but clear. A gaunt man with a thin mustache stepped forward, bowing. His accent suggested he hailed from one of the smaller villages just south of the city. He explained that his goats had been attacked during the night, scorched remnants found near his pen. He worried the dragons might have been responsible. Daenerys felt a pang. The dragons were fed regularly. She had tried to ensure they did not need to hunt local livestock, but she also knew that young dragons tested their boundaries. She asked him for details, tracks, sightings, the color of any scales he might have glimpsed. He admitted he saw only shadows in the moonlight. Yet there had been a powerful smell of sulfur. Daenerys frowned. It was possible that one of the brood had slipped away unnoticed. She promised compensation for the lost goats, plus assistance from her watchers to ensure the pen was reinforced. The man bowed in relief, though he still looked wary. She assured him that she would look into the matter. Once he left, she jotted notes on a scrap of parchment. She would question her watchers, see if any dragon was unaccounted for in the night. She would not ignore such warnings. That was how fear took root. The next petitioner was an older woman representing a fishing collective. She requested permission to set up permanent stalls near the new pier, which they would share with freedmen's port residents. Daenerys considered the request, realized it could encourage more trade, and granted permission so long as a small portion of the proceeds went toward the settlement's communal store. The woman bowed with gratitude, offering a basket of fresh shellfish in thanks. Daenerys smiled and accepted it gracefully. After nearly an hour more of hearing pleas and disputes, everything from property lines to noise complaints, Daenerys dismissed the gathering. She stepped outside into the bright, late-day sun, taking a moment to breathe. The settlement bustled around her, and she glimpsed children running toward the shallows where the silver dragon stood, half-submerged, blowing bubbles in the surf. The children shrieked in giddy amazement, though they kept their distance. Meanwhile, the copper soared above, chasing gulls with lazy swipes of its claws. A few older folks watched from a safe vantage, torn between awe and caution. She made her way toward the makeshift infirmary where a small group of healers operated under a canvas roof. They treated both the settlement's folk and any injured from Meereen. As she passed, the white dragon, typically shy, peeked from behind a crate stacked with fish. It peered at her with its large, pale eyes, flicking its tongue at the smell. She smiled and tossed it a small fish from the top of the stack, which it snatched delicately. Then it scurried off, wings fluttering. The once-wounded red dozed nearby under a piece of cloth rigged for shade, its wing almost fully healed now, though it still favored that side when in flight. Daenerys' heart warmed at the sight. Months ago, she had feared that injury might cripple it for good. As she stood there, inhaling the brine-scented wind, a shadow passed overhead. Drogon landed on a rocky outcrop near the beach, kicking up a swirl of sand. In the bright sun, his scales gleamed with hints of purple undertones and almost regal sheen. He let out a low rumble that echoed through the settlement, a reminder of his presence and power. The sight comforted Daenerys even as it stirred a twinge of sorrow. She would never forget how close she had come to losing herself in rage, with Drogon at her side, raining devastation on King's Landing. But here, he was a guardian, a sentinel of a new era that she was painstakingly trying to shape. She approached him slowly, letting her hand brush the edge of his jaw. His breath washed over her, hot and smelling of ash. She felt his immense strength coiled beneath her palm. The bond between them, mother and dragon, was something that transcended words. Even when she had lost her way, Drogon had chosen her, carried her from danger, fought for her. Now he seemed to sense her desire for peace, as though he, too, had tired of endless war. "Stay watchful," she murmured as if he understood every word. She knew he couldn't truly parse human speech, but he recognized tone, recognized her closeness. He flicked his tail and let out a softer rumble, acknowledging her. Then he launched himself back into the sky, wings creating a rush of air that whipped her cloak around her legs. Glancing inland, Daenerys saw the outline of Meereen's city walls rising in the distance. A pang of memory struck her, the Great Pyramid, the throne room where she had once tried to serve justice. So many battles, so many hopes entangled in those streets. Now, the city was in a tenuous alliance with her settlement. Kala remained her main contact on the council, though several other members had softened their stance. The liberators of Meereen, that violent faction, had mostly dispersed after seeing that Daenerys was not repeating the old mistakes. A few rabble-rousers still posted graffiti from time to time, calling for the dragons to be expelled, but they lacked widespread support. The city was, for now, steady. She sighed and returned to her audience hall, where Darrow awaited her with a rolled parchment in hand. He wore a grim expression. "My queen," he said softly, "a message came from the city. Kala sends word that a delegation from Yukai arrived this morning. They have been asking about you." The name Yukai conjured old memories. Another city in Slaver's Bay, once proud of its slave trade, once subdued by her armies. She had freed thousands of slaves there, only to find many in power resentful. She recalled humiliating the wise masters who had believed their gold could buy anything, including her compliance. Later, she had tried to negotiate peace, but the region had spiraled into war. Now they seemed to have reemerged. She unrolled the parchment, scanning Kala's hurried script. It said that the Yunkish delegation claimed they came in peace, bearing a proposal for renewed trade agreements, but that they specifically wished to meet Daenerys face to face. Kala confessed uncertainty about their true motives. Daenerys's lips thinned. Yukai had always been slippery. They might bring polite words while harboring hidden agendas. Yet she could not dismiss them outright. If she wanted her settlement and Meereen to flourish, she needed stable relations with the wider region. Slavers Bay was rebranding itself, in a sense an uneasy transition away from the old, brutal systems of bondage. Perhaps the Yunkish had finally come around to a more diplomatic approach. Or perhaps they wanted to pry open old wounds. She handed the parchment back to Darrow. Reply that I will meet them under the condition that they come outside the city walls, near the main gates, in a neutral space. I won't allow them to see the dragons up close without trust, but neither will I walk blindly into any trap. Kala can observe, and so can the council if they wish. Darrow nodded. Shall I prepare an escort? Yes, she said. A small one. We don't want to appear hostile, but we can't appear weak. And Darrow, make certain there are watchers placed in the sky. If the Yunkish attempt anything, Drogon will respond. He bowed. At once, my queen. She paused, meeting his eyes. You don't have to call me that, she said quietly. I have no throne here. He smiled wryly. You'll always be my queen, Daenerys. I've followed you through nightmares. I'll follow you still. His devotion humbled her. She patted his arm in silent gratitude, then turned away, mind already racing. Yukai. The memories stirred old resentment, how they had resisted her at every step, tried to sabotage her reforms. She must not let bitterness cloud her judgment now. She had sworn to approach each new challenge with caution and empathy for the sake of the dragons and the people who looked to her for leadership. The following day, she prepared for the meeting. She donned a more formal outfit, an elegant but simple gown of deep blue linen, belted at the waist, with practical sandals rather than slippers. She took no crown, no scepter, only the ring with the dragon's sigil that reminded her of her family's heritage. A small retinue of men and women, some armed with spears, accompanied her on horseback to the chosen meeting site outside Meereen's main gates. Kala and 3 council members waited there under a canopy to shade them from the sun. The city's gates stood open, guarded by a handful of watchmen. Beyond the walls stretched the well-trodden roads leading into the interior of Slavers Bay. Dust motes shimmered in the heat. The Yunkish delegation arrived late in the morning, preceded by a swirl of pomp. Their caravan had half a dozen ornate palanquins, richly dressed servants, and camels laden with embroidered blankets. The sheer opulence hinted at the wealth Yukai still commanded, even if their slave trade had been curtailed. At the head of the procession rode 2 men, one tall and slender, garbed in flowing yellow silk robes, and the other stout and heavily bejeweled, wearing a turban studded with gems. They halted before the canopy, dismounted awkwardly, then stepped forward with exaggerated bows. Daenerys Targaryen, said the tall one, in accented common tongue. How the world has turned since we last met. I am Morezno, envoy of the Yunkish Council. This is Yidros, my colleague. We bring you greetings from our city. Behind him, the stout man, Yidros, inclined his head with a guarded smile. Daenerys offered a polite dip of her chin. Welcome. The roads have been quiet, I hope. They exchanged pleasantries, affirming the journey was safe. Daenerys ushered them under the canopy, where Kala introduced herself and the other Meereenese council members. The Yunkish praised the city's resilience and complimented Daenerys for her rumored transformation from war queen to peaceful leader. She listened, wary of flattery. Then they presented their reason for coming. Yukai wished to reopen trade routes with Meereen and the Freedmen's Port. Morezno spoke of caravans bearing exotic spices, silks, precious metals. In return, they would purchase grain, fish, and other goods from local farmers and fishermen. Daenerys studied them carefully. Trade is good, she said, but Yunkai's wealth was built on slavery. We do not condone such practices, nor will we allow slavers to operate in Meereen's territory. Yidros spread his bejeweled hands in a gesture of appeasement. We are aware of your stance, O Storeborn. Yukai has adapted. We still have labor arrangements, but it is not the same as before, I assure you. Contracts, wages, though modest. We do not wish to provoke hostility by reverting to old ways. Kala watched them, expression measured. We will require proof, she said quietly. Many freedmen in Meereen once suffered under Yunkish whips. Yidros' mouth twitched. As you say, we come to build alliances, not tear them down. He turned his gaze on Daenerys, his tone growing more personal. However, there is another matter. Rumors abound that the Dragon Queen has more dragons. We have heard the stories. The sight of them in the sky. Yukai wonders if these creatures might serve as a bulwark against the many threats in the region. Pirates still plague the coasts, certain free companies roam the deserts. If we were to formalize a pact of mutual defense, perhaps your dragons would guard our caravans as well. Naturally, we would pay generously. Daenerys' jaw tightened. She recalled how Yukai once tried to hire Sel's words against her. Now they wanted to hire her dragons. She forced herself to remain composed. My dragons are not mercenaries. They do not fight for gold. However, if we have a trade alliance, we can discuss how to ensure safe passage for caravans. That does not mean I will deploy dragons at Yunkai's beck and call. Morezno spread his hands. Of course, we understand. Merely a suggestion. Perhaps we can formalize it so that if any threat arises on the roads, Meereen or your freedman's port might dispatch forces to help. A shared watch, so to speak. We have no illusions about controlling dragons. We only wish to benefit from your goodwill. Daenerys regarded Kala, inviting her input. Kala cleared her throat. Meereen is still rebuilding. We do not have large forces to spare. But if a mutual defense pact can be established without violating our principles, meaning no reintroduction of slavery, then we might consider it. Trade with Yunkai could be lucrative after all. The Yunkish envoys nodded eagerly. Daenerys suppressed a flicker of discomfort. She feared that funneling more wealth into Yukai might indirectly empower old slaver factions, no matter their promises. But rejecting them outright might sow conflict. She recalled how Slavers Bay had been ravaged by repeated wars and interventions. Perhaps a pragmatic approach was best. Keep Yukai close enough to watch them, set strict terms that discourage backsliding into slavery. And if they did, well, dragons could respond swiftly. They spent the remainder of the morning haggling over details. Daenerys insisted that any caravans traveling to Freedman's Port or Meereen must be inspected by local authorities to ensure no slaves were hidden among their goods. Yidros balked, but eventually conceded. The Yunkish demanded certain trade concessions, lower tariffs, priority docking for their ships if they ventured by sea. Kala and the Meereenese council members argued that any special privilege should be matched with an investment in local infrastructure. Finally, they reached a provisional understanding, a trial period of trade with set taxes and inspections. If all went well after a year, they could expand the pact. When the meeting concluded, the Yunkish envoys offered parting gifts, delicate vials of perfume, bolts of fine cloth, a casket of spiced wine. Daenerys accepted them cautiously, suspecting they might hide listening devices or some other cunning trick. But upon a quick inspection by her guards, the items appeared legitimate. Morezno and Yidros departed with elaborate bows, promising to send official envoys soon to finalize the agreement. When their caravan vanished down the dust-shrouded road, Daenerys exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. Kala gave her a sidelong look. "Think we can trust them?" she asked. "No," Daenerys replied frankly. "But I think we can manage them. At least now we have an accord. If they break it, we'll know they never meant peace, and they'll confirm themselves as foes." Kala nodded. "So it goes in Slavers Bay. Better a wary peace than no peace at all." She gestured to the gates. "Would you like to come inside? The council is meeting to discuss the next steps." Daenerys hesitated. Meereen's council chambers still held ghosts for her, old memories of frustration, of plots that had nearly undone her. Yet she had vowed to be more involved, not to run at the first sign of difficulty. "All right," she agreed. "I'll come, but I won't stay long. My brood needs me." Together, they entered the city. The streets hummed with commerce, though traffic parted before Daenerys and her small escort. Whispers followed, the Dragon Queen. Some smiled, some scowled, but fewer than in the past. The marketplace was lively, stalls piled high with fruits, jars of honey, dried fish. Daenerys recognized a few of the vendors from her earliest days of rule. They looked older, thinner, but they still managed to wave or nod respectfully. She offered them small smiles, hoping to convey that she remembered them well. At the Great Pyramid's base, they ascended the same grand steps she had once walked with so much determination. The council chamber was smaller than it had been in her time, an antechamber rather than the grand throne room. She approved of that choice, less pomp, more practicality. A half-dozen council members, including the older man who had questioned her fiercely months ago, sat around a circular table. A few scribes hovered at the edges, ready to note official business. Daenerys took a seat near Kala, ignoring the pang of nostalgia that threatened. She could almost see Missandei's kind face, Ser Barristan's quiet dignity, Grey Worm's stoic presence. All gone now, scattered to the winds or passed on in blood and battle. The meeting began with a brief recap of the Yunkai negotiations, then moved on to matters of city management. A water shortage in one district, a dispute over taxes in another. Daenerys mostly listened, interjecting occasionally with suggestions for fair resolution. The older man, Lesoro, she recalled, still eyed her with some distrust, but he seemed more inclined to hear her out. She wondered if he, too, had witnessed how her dragons had protected the city from pirates, or if he had seen her quell the Liberators' riot with diplomacy. Perhaps those deeds had softened his view. As they moved through a dull discussion of grain distribution, a guard burst into the chamber, breathless. "Pardon," he gasped. "A riot in the eastern quarter. The fisherfolk have clashed with a group of laborers over market space. Stones and knives are being thrown." The council jumped to their feet. Kala cursed under her breath. "We thought that quarter was peaceful now. These tension points keep flaring." Daenerys rose as well. "Let's go," she said. "I'll help calm it if I can." Lesoro eyed her warily. "That might just incite them further. Some see you as a meddler." She shook her head. "We can't leave it to fester. I'll approach them the same way I did with the Liberators, unarmed. If they hate me, they can shout in my face. Better that than them stabbing each other." No one had a better idea. The council hurriedly agreed, forming a small group of city guards and scribes to accompany them. Daenerys left her personal escort behind in the chamber, not wanting to appear as though she was imposing her authority on the city. Together with Kala and Lesoro, she descended the pyramid and rushed through the narrow streets toward the eastern quarter. In the distance, they heard angry shouting, the clank of metal. People fled past them, fear etched on their faces. They arrived at a wide intersection where a fish market bordered a cluster of weaving workshops. A throng of men and women faced off, brandishing knives, cudgels, sharpened poles. Broken baskets and spilled fish littered the ground along with smashed weaving frames. The tension crackled in the air. At the heart of it, Daenerys saw two figures locked in a furious argument, one a brawny fisherman, the other a wiry weaver. Each shouted accusations about stolen stalls, blocked lanes, intimidation. Others in the mob roared their support, brandishing weapons. City guards had formed a loose perimeter, but they seemed hesitant to intervene. Kala and Lesoro stepped forward, trying to call for calm, but the crowd's anger drowned them out. Daenerys took a deep breath and strode into the middle of the intersection, raising her voice so all could hear. "Stop this madness," she cried. "No fish, no cloth, no trade is worth spilling each other's blood." They recognized her immediately, and a hush rippled through the crowd. The fisherman spat on the ground, glaring at her. "What do you know of our struggles, Dragon Queen? You live by the sea outside the walls with your scaled beasts. These scum block our route to market, extort money we cannot pay." The weaver, trembling with rage, pointed at the fisherman. "They threatened to burn our workshop if we didn't yield space. They act like they own the entire district just because fish sells well. We need to sell cloth to feed our families too." Daenerys nodded gravely. She glanced around, noting the signs of poverty, threadbare clothes, hollow cheeks, angry eyes that spoke of desperation. Meereen was still fragile, the economy only recently recovering. People clung to survival, and that led to conflict. She lifted her hands, palms open, and addressed the entire crowd. "Look at yourselves. You've both struggled since the wars. You're all trying to carve out a living in these difficult times. Fighting each other, damaging goods, injuring neighbors, does it truly help? Or does it leave everyone poorer, angrier?" Several in the crowd shifted, eyes lowered. But the fisherman refused to back down. "We have no choice. They want more stalls than we have room for. We're the ones who bring fresh fish to the city, feeding families cheaply. The weavers can set up in another quarter. Why encroach here?" The weaver bristled. "That's nonsense. The vantage here is good for foot traffic. Why should we be banished to a far corner to starve? You fishermen already hog half the stalls." Daenerys listened carefully, stepping closer to them. Kala and Lesoro moved behind her, tension in their faces. She could feel the crowd's anger simmering, ready to explode at any perceived insult. Clearing her throat, Daenerys spoke in a level tone. "We can solve this without blades. Fishermen need access to the immediate market, yes, but weavers also need a fair chance to sell goods to those who pass by. Could we not set up a rotating schedule of stalls or designate certain days for the fishermen to occupy a specific row while leaving space for the weavers on others? The city can help coordinate so no one is crowded out." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked skeptical, but others seemed willing to consider it. The fisherman and the weaver exchanged resentful glances, neither wanting to give ground. Kala seized the moment, raising her voice. We, the council, will support Daenerys's proposal. We can arrange official oversight of the market distribution. Anyone who tries to seize extra stalls without permission will face fines or removal. Lissaro added, we can also lower the stall fees temporarily so more people can afford space. But this must remain peaceful. No more fighting. The fisherman began to protest, but Daenerys fixed him with a steady gaze. If you keep clashing, if you burn workshops or harm weavers, I promise you the city will not stand aside. We will not let violence run unchecked. The same goes for you, she said, turning to the weaver. No forced extortion, no sabotage. Understood. Grudging nods. The tension remained thick, but the presence of Daenerys and the council gave them pause. A few in the crowd lowered their makeshift weapons, muttering. The weaver, still scowling, asked, what if they break the agreement? Daenerys's voice was calm. Then come to the council or to me directly. We will enforce fairness. You need not swing a blade to be heard. She looked around. If you have no faith in that, then we may as well keep killing each other until no one is left to sell fish or cloth. A quiet hush fell. At last, the fisherman and the weaver both lowered their eyes, the anger draining from them in weary resignation. Daenerys and the council members spent some time gathering statements, ensuring no one was gravely injured. She ordered the city guard to remain in the area for several days to enforce the compromise. By the end of it all, the crowd dispersed, some sullen, some hopeful. As the dust settled, Daenerys felt a tremor in her legs from the stress of it. The memory of King's Landing's madness still lurked in her mind, a reminder of how quickly crowds could turn into infernos. But this time, words had prevailed. Back at the pyramid, Kala pulled her aside. You're good at that, she said quietly. Talking them down. People listen to you, even those who claim to hate you. Daenerys managed a tight smile. I've learned the hard way that violence breeds violence. If there's a chance words can end a conflict, I must try. Kala's expression was complicated admiration, caution. Your presence in Meereen is changing the city again. You've grown a dedicated following among the impoverished. They see you as their champion. But others worry that you'll overshadow the council's authority, eventually steering Meereen back under your sole rule. Some fear that, for all your words, your dragons remain the final argument. Daenerys looked at the mosaic floor. I have no throne, Kala, and no desire for one. But I can't just watch from the outside when people tear each other apart. If the council needs me to step back, tell me and I will. I don't wish to become a usurper. Kala touched her arm gently. I believe you. But it's a fine line to walk. Keep showing restraint, keep working with the council, and maybe in time, old wounds will heal. For now, rest. You've done enough for one day. She left the city with conflicting emotions. She had prevented a riot, but the underlying desperation remained. Meereen was a scarred place, still bruised by the turmoil of repeated wars. And she, Daenerys Targaryen, was at once a symbol of hope and a looming threat. Her footsteps were dogged by ghosts. Yet she drew strength from the knowledge that she now embraced dialogue over devastation. Let the memory of King's Landing's flames serve as a warning of what she must never do again. Back at Freedman's Port, she found the settlement calm. The silver dragon sunned itself on a rocky ledge, the green and the copper soared in lazy arcs above the shore. The gray perched on a half-finished watchtower, tail twitching as it surveyed passing seagulls. The white rummaged in the shallows for shellfish, while the red napped under a wooden awning, carefully shifting its still-mending wing. Drogon, always the solitary sentinel, circled at a higher altitude, barely a speck against the pale sky. She made her way to the newly constructed infirmary where she often checked on the injured who drifted in. A slender woman in a rough-spun dress greeted her with a curtsy, explaining that some fishermen had minor cuts from an accident at sea. Daenerys soothed them, ensuring the herbal salves were sufficient. She was no maester, but months of adversity had taught her basic healing techniques. Overseeing the small place reminded her of times when she had tried to show mercy and care amid the harshness of Essos. As the sun fell toward the horizon, she wandered the beach, letting the gentle waves lap at her ankles. She spotted Darrow and Bala returning from a foraging trip, leading pack mules loaded with wild fruits. In the distance, a group of Freedman's Port children laughed as the copper dragon chased a kite they had made from stitched rags. The day's tension ebbed from her shoulders. This was what she had dreamed of, dragons living alongside people without terror, forging a fragile harmony. Was it perfect? No. Fear still lingered, wars might still erupt. But it was a step. After dusk, she convened her closest allies near a bonfire on the sand. They ate roasted fish, drank watered wine, and spoke of the day's events. She told them of the riot she had quelled, the Yunkish delegation's visit, her concern that outside forces might try to destabilize Meereen. some worried about larger threats. Resurgent slavers or even old foes from Westeros seeking to exploit rumors of her survival. Daenerys listened calmly, though her heart pounded at the mention of Westeros. She still felt the pull of that distant land, the place of her birthright and her greatest tragedy. Could she ever face it again without being consumed by guilt? By the time the bonfire dwindled, the night sky glittered with 1,000 stars. Daenerys walked to the makeshift roost where the hatchlings slept. She found them curled in a circle of warm stones. Each lifted its head when she approached, blinking with luminous eyes. She sat among them, letting their scaled bodies press against her legs. They were bigger now, heavier, but they still made room for her, regarding her as a mother figure. She felt their slow breathing vibrate through her own chest. Stroking the gray's neck, she reflected on how, not so long ago, she had discovered these eggs in the haunted depths of old Valyria, risking everything for the faint hope of resurrecting her legacy. Now that legacy lay around her, a ring of living creatures bound to her by blood and magic. "You must never become harbingers of destruction," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I won't let that happen again." She thought of Drogon's roar echoing over the Red Keep, flames devouring innocence. The memory haunted her dreams. But these 6, if raised with discipline and compassion, might one day surpass even Drogon's primal might, forging a new path for dragons in a changing world. Or so she prayed. That night, she barely slept, roused by nightmares of cities aflame, hearing the distant screams that once tore through King's Landing. She awoke in a sweat, heart hammering, the sound of ocean waves outside her simple cabin. For a moment, she expected to see smoke curling beneath the door. But she was safe, and the settlement outside was peaceful under the moonlight. She closed her eyes, breathed in the brine-scented air, and whispered a prayer to the gods, whichever might listen, to guide her better than before. In the coming weeks, the Yunkish caravans began arriving. Inspections proved that, indeed, no slaves were hidden among their goods, at least none that Daenerys's watchers could detect. Myrrine's marketplace filled with new luxuries, and Freedman's port thrived on the trade. Fishermen sold their catches at higher prices, artisans found ready customers, and the budding city slowly patched its scars. The dragons, for their part, adapted to the increased activity. They soared over the caravans, occasionally scaring the Yunkish guards but never attacking. Daenerys kept them well fed, hoping to prevent any unfortunate incidents. A few times, the red or the green would circle a camel laden with spices. Curiosity piqued, but they never set it aflame. Yunkish merchants, while nervous, grew used to the draconic silhouettes overhead, many even boasting upon returning home that they had bartered under a dragon's watchful eye. As trust marginally increased, the Freedman's port gained new settlers. Word spread that Daenerys was forging a community guided by fairness, protected by dragons. Former slaves from as far as Astapor trickled in, seeking a life unshackled from old overlords. Some brought families, setting up small farms or workshops. The settlement's architecture gradually improved, sturdier houses, a larger infirmary, a communal gathering hall. Daenerys oversaw it all with quiet dedication, granting land where needed, arbitrating disputes justly. She felt echoes of her early days as a Khaleesi when she had led a Khalasar across the Red Waste with only her conviction to guide them. But this time she had resources, allies, and a deeper understanding of how fragile freedom could be. One morning, however, fresh trouble arrived. A Myrinese messenger galloped into Freedman's port at dawn, nearly collapsing with exhaustion. Daenerys rushed to meet him in the courtyard outside her audience hall. He stammered a dire warning. A warband of unknown origin had attacked a village near Myrine's eastern border, killing or enslaving many. Survivors fled to the city, speaking of large, well-organized raiders who bore no familiar banners. Some claimed they were sellswords, others rumored they were reconstituted slaver factions from outside Slavers Bay. Kala's official note, delivered by the messenger, requested Daenerys' assistance. Myrine's council feared the warband would strike again. They had few forces able to defend outlying villages. The note hinted strongly that the city expected Daenerys to use her dragons for protection as part of their mutual agreement to keep the region safe. Reading it, Daenerys felt her blood run cold. The notion of marauders enslaving innocents under her nose was intolerable. Yet she also felt a chill of foreboding. If she unleashed her dragons in open conflict, how quickly might it spiral? She closed her eyes, recalling how a single command of Dracarys could end hundreds of lives. She refused to let her dragons become butchers again. Still, to do nothing would be a betrayal of the people who looked to her for defense. She summoned her closest advisors, including Darrow and Balor, along with a few Freedman's port captains who had experience in combat. They convened in the audience hall around a rough map of the region, marking the village that had been attacked. Reports said the raiders numbered possibly 300 or more, well-armed, traveling swiftly. Daenerys asked if they had identified any symbol or leader. The messenger shook his head. No consistent rumor had emerged yet. So, Daenerys said, voice taut, we have a sizable threat roving near Meereen, preying on villages. They might target Freedman's Port next, or they may strike other villages first. We have to protect them. Darrow leaned over the map. We have watchers with bows. We can muster maybe 100 fighters from Freedman's Port, but many are not trained warriors. We could ask Meereen for more soldiers, but they may be slower to deploy. Bala tapped the map where a series of low hills stretched near the border. If the raiders are currently occupying that territory, we could intercept them before they spread further. A swift strike might work. Daenerys shook her head. A strike with what army? Our best chance for a quick victory is the dragons, but using them on such a large scale risks chaos and civilian casualties if the fight spills near villages. She sighed, forcing herself to consider carefully. We might do a show of force. Drogon and 1 or 2 of the brood could harry the raiders from the air, intimidate them, scatter them, while ground forces secure the roads and rescue any captives. Darrow folded his arms. If we strike, we must ensure we keep a tight leash on the dragons. One moment of panic and we could burn the entire countryside. We need an approach that avoids a wide inferno. Daenerys looked around the table. Let's plan precisely. A single pass of dragon fire at the outskirts might make them flee. Meanwhile, we position ground troops to cut off retreat routes and free prisoners. We do not want to kill them all. If they have captives, we must prioritize rescue. We also need at least 1 or 2 alive for questioning to find out who sent them. They agreed on a strategy. Daenerys would lead Drogon and the Silver and Grey dragons. The Silver had shown the calmest temperament and the Grey possessed a more cautious, observant nature. The Red, Green, and Copper would remain at Freedman's Port in case of an unexpected attack. Darrow would command the ground forces with Balar. Meereen, upon receiving word, would send a small detachment to help secure the roads. The entire operation needed to be swift, targeted, and mindful of civilians. Daenerys felt tension coil in her chest. This was the first time since King's Landing that she would lead dragons in an offensive. She prayed she had the fortitude to control the outcome. They mobilized quickly. By midday, Daenerys flew Drogon eastward, the Silver and Grey flanking him in somewhat wobbly formation. She felt a tingle of adrenaline coursing through her. It had been a long time since she soared into the sky with the intent of battle. The wind whipped her hair, and the day was clear, the land below stretching in a mosaic of fields and hills. She kept a tight grip on Drogon's reins, more symbolic than functional, but a reminder to him of her presence. Beneath her, she sensed his power pulsing with each wing beat. In the distance, she spotted wisps of smoke rising from a cluster of huts near a winding river. Her heart clenched. That might be another village under attack. She directed Drogon downward, and he answered with a dive that left her stomach lurching. The Silver and Grey followed, letting out piercing cries that echoed across the open sky. They arrived to find the settlement half-burned, villagers fleeing in panic. Daenerys saw armed men in mismatched armor shouting orders, dragging captives. At the sight of dragons overhead, some raiders froze in terror. Others raised crossbows. She scanned for any sign of a banner or insignia, but saw only ragged clothing and bits of rusted plate. One figure, possibly their leader, yelled something unintelligible, gesturing for them to scatter. Daenerys guided Drogon into a sweeping pass. Dracarys, she murmured, but aimed it at a patch of empty ground away from the villagers. Drogon's flame erupted in a thunderous roar, scorching the dirt, sending raiders diving for cover. The sudden display of draconic might broke their cohesion. Many fled immediately, dropping weapons and captives alike. The Silver and Grey circled around, unleashing smaller gouts of fire on the outskirts, enough to cut off escape without incinerating everything. Their flames were potent but not yet at Drogon's scale. A few bold raiders fired crossbow bolts at Daenerys. One whistled past her shoulder. Another struck Drogon's flank, but it deflected off a thick scale. The beast roared in anger. She felt the rumble through her entire body. Fighting her instinct to level the raiders with unstoppable fire, she shouted, "Enough. They're fleeing. Let them run." She wanted to isolate pockets of resistance, not torch them blindly. Drogon roared again, turning his head as if to torch a cluster of men who scurried toward the river. She pulled on his harness. "No," she commanded sharply. He growled but obeyed, soaring higher instead. On the ground, Darrow's forces swept in from the west, while Bale led a flank from the east. They clashed with raiders who were too slow or too foolish to flee. Daenerys saw a swirl of chaos, villagers crying out, swords clanging, men wrestled to the dirt. The silver and gray hovered overhead, snapping at a few raiders who tried to scatter across the fields. Within minutes, the fighting ebbed. Most raiders had fled, leaving a handful captured or dead. Freed slaves stumbled out of huts, some weeping, some clutching wounds. Daenerys landed Drogon in the village center, heart pounding. Smoke her. Led from broken rooftops. She slid from Drogon's side, quickly scanning for threats. The silver landed next, flapping its wings nervously while the gray settled on a charred wooden post, eyes darting. Villagers trembled at the sight of the dragons, but Daenerys called out, "They will not harm you if you stay back. We've come to help." Her men moved among the survivors, offering water, tending to injuries. Balu approached with a bound prisoner in tow, an older man with a scar across his cheek. He glared at Daenerys, spitting at her feet. "Kinslayer," he hissed. "Targaryen scum." She fought to keep her composure. "You're the one terrorizing villages. Who do you serve?" He sneered. "We serve those who pay in gold, and your meddling won't stop us. Dragons or not, the region will bleed." Darrow twisted the man's arm. "Answer properly." With a grunt of pain, the prisoner muttered, "We're a company from further east. There are bigger lords behind us." Word reached them that Meereen was growing fat and soft again. "Easy pickings. You're not the only one building an empire, Targaryen." Daenerys' pulse quickened. "Who are these lords? Yunkish? Valentine?" The man's eyes glinted with contempt. "That's all I'll say. Kill me if you like. Others will come." She considered her options. She could threaten him with dragon fire, but she refused to stoop to torture. "Lock him up," she told Darrow. "We'll see if Meereen's dungeons loosen his tongue." More of her men gathered. They had freed perhaps 24 captives, mostly villagers who had been roped or caged. Some had whip marks on their backs, fresh burns on their arms, proof these raiders were already engaging in a new brand of slavery. Daenerys' blood boiled at the sight. She saw a young mother clutching a child, the child's wide eyes staring at her with terror, which only partly eased when they realized Daenerys was not one of the raiders. Overcome by the memory of her vow to protect the innocent, Daenerys knelt and took the mother's hand, promising them shelter in Freedman's Port until they could rebuild. Above them, the silver dragon let out a warbling cry. Another raider had tried to slip away behind a half-burned shack. The gray swooped down, hissing, its jaws snapping just short of the fleeing man. He dropped his weapon and collapsed in surrender. Daenerys exhaled relief. The hatchlings were responding to her training, chasing enemies rather than incinerating them blindly. They spent hours securing the village, gathering the wounded. Meereen's reinforcements arrived by late afternoon, assisting in clearing debris and rounding up stragglers. The raid had been brutal but brief. Most of the raiders vanished back into the eastern hills. Daenerys sent the silver and gray to scout overhead, searching for the main warband's camp. They returned at dusk, letting out frustrated shrieks, apparently unable to locate a sizable encampment in the rugged terrain. She left a small garrison of Freedman's Port watchers in the village for protection, then flew back to her settlement on Drogon, the silver and gray trailing. The flight was somber. For the first time in months, Daenerys had unleashed dragons in combat. She had kept them under control, avoided widespread carnage, but the tension in her limbs would not subside. Could she keep this up if the warband regrouped? If some bigger threat came, would she be able to restrain her dragons from the savage instincts that once consumed them? She thought of the prisoner's words, "Others will come." Slavers' Bay was ripe for exploitation by any warlord or tyrant who saw opportunity. She arrived at Freedman's Port to a subdued welcome. Darrow followed on horseback, leading the captives and rescued villagers. Many settled folks rushed forward with supplies, blankets, and sympathy. Daenerys remained near Drogon, stroking his flank, feeling his heartbeat like a distant drum. The silver and gray landed among their siblings, exchanging guttural rumbles as if recounting the skirmish. The red sniffed at the silver's tail, seemingly alarmed by the lingering scent of ash. Daenerys saw no signs of major injuries on the dragons, just a few small crossbow scratches on Drogon's hide. She cleansed them with water and mild antiseptic, whispering thanks for their restraint. That night, the settlement's healers worked overtime, tending the rescued villagers. Daenerys knelt beside the young mother and child she had encountered, trying to calm their trembling. She offered them a small lodging in the half-finished warehouse, ensuring they had clean water and food. The mother sobbed in gratitude, perhaps still in shock. Daenerys wondered how many more families would suffer if these raiders continued. At a late hour, she convened a meeting with her advisors by torchlight. They discussed the day's events, the unknown threat, and the steps to secure the region. Some urged sending out more scouts, possibly with the dragons, to scour the hills. Others warned that the raiders might be hiding in caves or gullies where dragons would struggle to navigate. Daenerys eventually decided on a combined approach. Ground scouts from Freedman's Port and Meereen would search carefully while the dragons patrolled overhead. No large-scale assault unless they located a clear enemy camp. Meanwhile, Freedman's Port would brace for possible retaliation. Despite the victory, Daenerys felt no triumph, only a weary resolve to defend her fragile peace. When the meeting ended, she stepped outside into the hush of the settlement. The moon hung low, silvering the waves. By the roost, she found Drogon awake, eyes glinting in the darkness, the brood curled around him. He blinked slowly when she approached, letting out a quiet rumble. She pressed her forehead against his snout, tears prickling her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening to me. For holding back." He exhaled, a warm gust stirring her hair. She felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on her soul. All around them, Freedman's Port slumbered uneasily, watchmen pacing with spears, ready for any sign of trouble. Her dragons, her people, how many more battles would they face before true stability took root? Word of the raid spread fast. Over the next days, Kulla arrived from Meereen, conferring with Daenerys about strategies to fortify outlying villages. Yunkish merchants, hearing of the unrest, demanded extra security for their caravans. Daenerys worried that the panic might choke the new trade if travelers feared being attacked on the roads. She arranged for volunteer escorts drawn from Freedman's Port. Some carried bows or spears, wearing improvised armor. The sight of dragons overhead offered additional comfort, though not all caravans wanted to risk traveling within flame's reach. Meanwhile, the Freedman's Port scouts returned with grim tidings. More villages to the east had been raided in previous weeks, though not as visibly. Some found only burnt remnants or discovered that many inhabitants had vanished, likely enslaved. The warbands seemed to avoid direct confrontation, striking swiftly and retreating into the hills. Daenerys spent sleepless nights pondering how to protect an entire region. Even with dragons, she could not be everywhere at once. Her brood was still young. If she sent them individually, they risked ambush. Drogon alone could handle many foes, but was it wise to spread her forces? She thought about forging alliances beyond Yukai, perhaps with other cities that had once known her name. But some had reasons to resent her. Others might fear entangling themselves. As the weeks wore on and more scouts returned with scarce progress, Daenerys felt a growing frustration. She found herself pacing the length of her audience hall, scanning the horizon each morning for the brood's return from their patrols. The silver, gray, and occasionally the green ventured out in rotation, gliding above roads and villages, but the raiders remained elusive. Then, one afternoon, a new face arrived at Freedman's Port, a slender man of uncertain heritage wearing travel-stained clothes. He asked to speak with Daenerys directly, presenting a token of a black dragon scale as proof of some secret knowledge. Intrigued yet cautious, she allowed him entry to her hall. He introduced himself as Javor, claiming to have intelligence about the raiders' paymaster. She studied his sharp features, his darting eyes. "Speak, then," she said, arms crossed. "But know that lying to me is unwise." He bowed, voice low. "I bring news from the east, rumors that a certain noble from Volantis has been hiring mercenaries with the aim of destabilizing Slaver's Bay. They believe that if Meereen collapses, the rest of the region can be carved up. I have heard that this noble's gold runs deep, enough to buy many cells' words. Your warband might be one of many." A chill slid down Daenerys' spine. Volantis was a powerful city, known for its own struggles with slavery and expansionist tendencies. She had never directly confronted them before, but she recalled the Red Priests who once declared her a chosen figure. Could this be one of their rivals, or a wealthy family that hated the idea of a Targaryen stronghold so close by? "If this is true, what proof do you have?" she demanded. Javor spread his hands. "None physical. Only whispered names and half-broken codes in mercenary lodges. But I know a leader of your warband goes by the name Kezer, once served in Volantis' private armies. He was exiled after a failed coup. Now he leads these brigands in your hills, seeking to pave a path for his employer. I heard rumors he's promised a lavish reward if he can break Meereen's defenses and deliver a chaos in which new slavers can flourish." Daenerys traded a grim look with Darrow, who had accompanied her. "Why bring this to me? What do you stand to gain?" Javor shrugged. "I was once enslaved by the same Volantene lords. I prefer to see them fail. If you drive out Kezer, maybe their plans crumble. I have no love for Targaryens or Meereen, but I hate them more. That's reason enough." She tested his honesty with questions about mercenary routes, hidden passes. He provided plausible details, small canyons that offered cover, known safe houses, hints of how Kezer might hide from dragons by day and move by night. It fit the pattern of the raiders' elusive behavior. Finally, Daenerys dismissed him with thanks, offering a small purse of coins for his troubles, though she made no promise of further reward. He left, face unreadable. Alone with Darrow, she paced. If the warband is led by an exiled Valentine, that changes things. We must track him specifically, cut off the head. The rest might scatter. Easier said than done, Darrow replied. Still, Javor's intel might help. We can plan targeted sweeps, focusing on passes used by night travelers. The question is, how do we catch Kezer without scorching half the countryside? Daenerys thought for a moment. We set a trap. If the raiders prefer to strike unsuspecting villages, we can bait them with a carefully defended settlement. We station watchers inside, keep dragons hidden until the raiders reveal themselves, then strike swiftly, avoid large-scale fire, but use Drogon to isolate their retreat. If Kezer is there, we capture him. Darrow eyed her with approval. Risky, but it might work if we pick a village they're likely to hit. Perhaps the region near the old salt mines. The raiders attacked once already, and we suspect they might strike again for supplies. People might blame us if there's collateral damage, though. That's why we'll evacuate all but a handful of volunteers, Daenerys said. We'll make it look inhabited, leave livestock as if it's unprotected. Then wait. So the plan formed. Daenerys met with Kala, who reluctantly agreed to a ruse involving one of the more vulnerable villages. They quietly evacuated the civilians to Meereen, leaving behind a dozen volunteers disguised as ordinary folk, along with a mix of Freedman's Port and Meereenese guards in hiding. At night, the gray, silver, and green dragons would remain out of sight, perched behind a ridge. Drogon and Daenerys would stay farther off, ready to swoop in once the raiders committed. It was a delicate operation. If the raiders smelled a trap, they'd vanish again. But if it succeeded, they might capture Kezer or at least deal a crushing blow to his forces. On a moonless night, Daenerys took her position on Drogon atop a low hill overlooking the village. The hush of the darkness weighed heavily. A few scattered lanterns glimmered in empty houses below, giving the impression of normal life. The silver, green, and gray lurked in the gloom of a larger hill, under the watchful eyes of Balor and Darrow. Daenerys' heart hammered in her chest. She hated using a village as bait, but if it ended the threat, it might save countless lives in the future. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, near midnight, shadows moved at the far edge of the village. Through a spyglass, Daenerys spotted figures on horseback, at least 30. More followed on foot. A larger group than usual. Perhaps Kezer had gathered his scattered forces for a final strike. They advanced cautiously, torches bobbing like fireflies. She saw them form a perimeter around the settlement, then creep toward the houses. It was time. She signaled with a shuttered lantern. Down below, the disguised volunteers fled indoors, feigning panic. The hidden guards readied crossbows behind walls. Daenerys waited, breath quivering, as the raiders drew nearer, suspicious but lured by the apparent ease of the target. At the front rode a tall figure in black armor, face hidden by a mask. Kezer, she guessed. The moment they entered the village square, her guards fired crossbow bolts. Cries rang out. Chaos erupted as the raiders realized the trap. Kezer roared orders, swords flashed. The volunteers fired from rooftops. Daenerys urged Drogon into the sky with a sharp command. With powerful wing beats, he soared over the village, letting out a fearsome roar that made the raiders falter. Fire lit the darkness, but she aimed at open ground, cutting off escape routes, not immolating them wholesale. At her second signal, the silver, green, and gray dragons swooped in, flanking the village. The clash was fierce. Some raiders threw spears at the younger dragons, who mostly dodged or deflected the attacks with scaled wings. The green blasted a small hut by mistake, setting it ablaze, but no one was inside. Daenerys hissed in frustration, urging Drogon to keep the main square free of flames. She saw Kezer wheel his horse around, trying to rally his men. She flew low, pointing at him. "Stop him!" she shouted to the guards below. Crossbow bolts whizzed through the air, one striking Kezer's horse. The beast reared and collapsed, throwing him. He scrambled to his feet, crossbow in hand. Draconic shadows flickered across the buildings, the roars and screams blending into a cacophony that chilled Daenerys' blood. She reminded herself of the plan: capture Khazar if possible. She circled with Drogon, searching for a safe spot to land. The silver soared by, loosing a narrow jet of flame that forced a cluster of raiders to drop their weapons. Another group tried to flee on horseback, but the gray landed in their path, jaws snapping. They reined back in panic, only to be cornered by Friedman's port watchers. The green spun overhead, shrieking as a javelin grazed its flank, but it responded by breathing fire at the ground in front of the thrower, enough to make them scatter. Daenerys glimpsed chaos in every corner, but it was controlled chaos, not the all-consuming inferno she remembered from her darkest moment. At last, she spotted Khazar trying to retreat down a narrow alley, alone and limping. She guided Drogon to land behind him, the beast's massive form blocking the alley. Khazar whirled, crossbow raised. Before he could shoot, Daenerys slid off Drogon's back and shouted, "Don't make me kill you. Surrender." He fired anyway. Drogon roared, but the bolt glanced off his scales. Daenerys stepped forward, a dagger in hand. Khazar snarled beneath his mask, drawing a curved sword. She tensed, recalling her lessons from Ser Jorah and Dario. He slashed at her, swift despite his limp. She parried with the dagger, sidestepping, feeling adrenaline surge. Drogon growled behind her, but she raised a hand for him to stay back. She needed Khazar alive if possible. His blade came at her again. She twisted aside, the wind from his strike brushing her cheek. She felt the old rush of battle, something she had seldom embraced. She blocked another strike, then ducked as he swung high. With her free hand, she grabbed his wrist, pivoting to unbalance him. He stumbled, cursing. She kicked his shin, and he crumpled to his knees with a grunt of pain, dropping the sword. Before he could recover, she pressed the dagger to his throat, panting. "Yield," she commanded, voice shaking. He spat at her, eyes wild through the slits of his mask. "Targaryen whore," he growled. "We'll burn your city to the ground one day. You can't hold off Volantis' gold forever." She tightened her grip, tempted to slice his throat. But that would solve nothing. She jerked his arm behind his back, forcing him down. "Drogon," she said softly, and the massive dragon advanced. Khazar tried to twist away, but he was pinned. Drogon lowered his head, hot breath washing over the man's face. Fear flickered in Khazar's eyes at last. "Call off your men," Daenerys demanded. "I can end this now." Khazar laughed bitterly. "They follow gold, not my voice. You may have them cornered tonight, but others will take our place. The lords of Volantis will never let you strengthen Slaver's Bay without a fight." Daenerys felt a pang of dread. This was bigger than a lone bandit group. Still, they had Khazar, the man with knowledge of who funded these raids. "We'll see," she said. "We'll see if your masters care enough to ransom you." She slammed the hilt of his own sword against his head, knocking him out cold. Drogon rumbled in approval or maybe disgust. From the main square, she heard the last echoes of battle fading. The trap had succeeded. The raiders were routed, captured, or dead. She took a moment to breathe, the taste of ash on her tongue, her limbs trembling. The alley stank of blood and soot, but at least the entire village wasn't in flames. She emerged, dragging Khazar's unconscious form. Her men rushed to help. The silver perched on a roof, watching with an almost curious tilt of its head. Daenerys' heart hammered at the close call. Another wave of relief washed over her as she saw that most of the huts stood intact. Friedman's port watchers were already stamping out small fires, herding surviving raiders into makeshift pens. Many had thrown down arms the moment dragons descended. She met eyes with Daro, who clapped her shoulder. "You did it," he said, voice hushed. "We have their leader." Daenerys glanced at the battered village. "At least we saved more from destruction." But Khazar hinted we face a larger threat from Volantis. This might only be the beginning. Daro's expression darkened. "Volantis is far. They have their own politics. But if they're meddling here," he trailed off. They both knew it spelled trouble. A major city like Volantis, with deep pockets and a proud tradition of slavery, might see Daenerys' rebirth in Slaver's Bay as an insult and a threat to their commerce. If they truly decided to expand their influence, Friedman's port could be next in line for war. They gathered the spoils, captured weapons, horses, supplies, freed the handful of slaves or forced laborers Khazar had brought with him. Then they marched the Prizo. Nas back to Friedman's port by dawn. Word spread of the successful ambush. People cheered Daenerys' name when they saw Khazar in chains, the brood overhead roaring triumph. She accepted the gratitude solemnly, remembering that each victory sowed seeds of future conflict. Khazar was locked in a secure stockade near the settlement's watchtower, under heavy guard. Kala arrived with Myrinese officials to question him, but he spat curses, revealing little beyond sneering threats of Volantis' wrath. Daenerys considered whether to exchange him for hostages or attempt to extract more information. She decided on a middle path, keep him prisoner until they could learn more about Volantis's plans. Culla warned that the longer they held him, the more reason Volantis might have to escalate tensions. We can't let fear rule us, Daenerys replied firmly. He attacked our people first. We have every right to demand answers or reparation before releasing him. Still, the thought of facing a city like Volantis in open warfare made Daenerys uneasy. She had only a fraction of the forces she once commanded. Her dragons were strong but not invincible, especially the younger ones. And Volantis was wealthy, able to hire fleets of mercenaries. Old anxieties flared. What if more violence became inevitable? Could she maintain her vow not to unleash a storm of fire and death? At least the immediate threat of Kezar's warband was neutralized. Freedman's Port and Meereen enjoyed a brief reprieve from raiding. Yunkish caravans continued as usual, their merchants now praising Daenerys for securing the region. Some even offered to invest in new roads to facilitate travel. The Freedman's Port settlement grew, its newly minted blacksmith forging better tools and weapons. The brood-sword daily patrols eliciting awe from watchers on city walls who glimpsed the glint of scales in the morning sun. One afternoon, as Daenerys oversaw the building of a larger communal granary, the red dragon landed near her with a shriek, nearly toppling a stack of timber. She'd left it in the settlement for the day while the silver, green, and gray patrolled. The red hopped around, knocking debris aside, seeming agitated. She noticed it was breathing heavily, eyes darting. Approaching cautiously, she ran a hand along its flank. The dragon hissed, then settled. She realized it might just be pent-up energy, its wing had fully healed and it yearned to fly more. She urged it to take to the sky, but it only paced as if searching for a challenge. Finally, she tossed it a large chunk of salted beef to calm it. It devoured the meat in seconds, then nuzzled her shoulder with surprising gentleness. She remembered how fiercely it had once snapped at her. Now it seemed to crave her approval. A flicker of longing passed through her. Each dragon was forging its own identity. The silver, with its affectionate manner and strong sense of loyalty, always soared closest to her in flight. The gray, aloof and watchful, guarded the perimeter with measured calm. The green, fiery and impulsive, craved the thrill of chase. The copper, playful and mischievous, often romped in the waves. The white, timid but growing bolder, had begun shadowing Drogon on hunts. And the red, once wounded, had a fierce pride that sometimes bordered on aggression, yet it too was learning restraint under her guidance. She thought of them as children coming into adulthood. They would soon be unstoppable forces of nature. That night, she sat by a small fire near the brood's nesting area, scribbling notes in a leather-bound journal, her personal reflections, half lament, half hopeful plan. She wrote of the day's successes, the building progress, the fear of Volantis, her cautious optimism about Kai, the lingering question of whether Westeros would ever matter again to her. The dragons lay scattered around her, dozing or gazing into the firelight with unblinking eyes. Drogon perched on a rocky ledge above, as was his habit, a silent guardian. With the crackle of flames in her ears, she let her mind wander. She remembered the House Targaryen words, fire and blood. Once she'd embraced them with righteous zeal, determined to break the wheel of tyranny. But now she saw the truth that fire and blood brought endless cycles of pain unless tempered by mercy. She was forging a new motto in her heart, though she hadn't spoken it aloud, fire to protect, not to ravage. Would it be enough to shape the dragon's destiny? She glanced at the horizon, where the silhouette of Meereen's pyramid was just visible against the night sky. If Volantis truly planned an incursion, they might bring warships, elephants, mercenary legions, or even try to sow rebellion inside Meereen's walls. Daenerys' slender forces and growing dragons might not suffice if a great power decided to crush her. But she refused to surrender to dread. She had come too far, sacrificed too much. She would not let Slavers Bay succumb again to chains. The dragons were her hope, as was every freedman who believed in a better future. Her thoughts turned unexpectedly to Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister, others she had left behind or lost in the ashes of Westeros. She wondered if any had survived, if they ever thought of her with regret or hatred. The memory stung, but she pushed it away. The dawn belonged to those she could save now, not the mistakes she could never erase. Steeling herself, she rose and walked among the sleeping dragons, gently touching their scales. She felt the thrum of life beneath her fingers. The night air smelled of salt and the faint sulfuric musk of dragon breath. "We move forward," she whispered, voice resolute. "No matter who threatens us, we will not become monsters again." Drogon rumbled softly from the rock as if in agreement. Daenerys settled against a warm stone near the brood, letting the shifting embers of her fire lull her into half-sleep. She dreamt of wide skies, of dragons flying free without fear, of a city that welcomed them not as conquerors but as protectors. She dreamt of a day when no one cowered at the mention of her name and no chain rattled in the darkness. Perhaps it was a foolish dream, but it was hers and she would guard it as fiercely as her dragons guarded her. When the first light touched the sea, she stirred, rising to continue her endless task, balancing power and mercy, forging alliances where once there was only enmity, guiding dragons who could reshape the world. Each new day was a step along the narrow road between hope and catastrophe, and she was determined, this time, to choose hope.